Congratulations. So today we have a preschool, and we'll begin the discussion by talking about the recent attack by the Trump administration on the elite universities, which Jeremiah is going to lead us. And then we'll talk about the upcoming music symposium, essentially 11th and 12th.
No, 10th and 11th.
Sorry, on 10th and 11th. And finally, we'll talk about the upcoming issue 4 of Avant-Garde, which I'm also very excited about.
I'm behind on that.
So we can begin the discussion.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so yeah, I tried to prepare for today, and honestly, it was a lot because there's so much happening and there's so many moving pieces. And I was, kind of anxious when Doc asked me to talk about it because I was like, I'm not even in the university. Like, maybe someone in the university could talk about it. So yeah, I think I will rely on a lot of people who are actually like within, like inside, like right now, and like can actually speak to like how people are responding. But I can just start us off with some like how I'm seeing things, like how also connecting it to topics and ideas that we've been discussing for a long time in free school. But I think the first thing is that obviously like what's happening between the Trump administration and these elite universities like Harvard and several others is obviously it's a political battle. It's also a legal battle, but foremost, I think it's an ideological battle. And that means as part of that we've said this before, but kind of embedded within that is a struggle over narrative hegemony, because you have all these competing narratives about even from the Trump administration, from the universities and in the media. And so like I wanted to just kind of try to capture those competing narratives and to also describe them in a way where it's like, what is the most overtly visible and apparent in this whole ideological struggle, and then what is more submerged and what is less apparent, but still important, if not more important. And I think actually one of the big questions that I feel like not just American people, but people around the world are asking is, why is Trump attacking or weakening the university as, especially when it's seen as one of the most vital pillars of American power? Like, why would you deliberately undermine this pillar of American power? And I think in the past we talked about, it may have been, was it Gideon Rothman who described the American university and the American dollar as kind of like the twin pillars of American power alongside like the American military? So I think this is a question that a lot of people, not just within the United States, but around the world are asking, like, why is Trump doing this? And I think that we see it as having everything to do with actually, I've been thinking about this more, but the kind of unresolved legacy of even the Third American Revolution and the crisis of the current US state and ruling elite, as well as these larger questions of war and peace and the genocide in Gaza. But I just kind of want to say that at the beginning, and then kind of give an overview of like what's actually happened with Trump and these universities, and it is unprecedented. I don't think that any sitting American president has mounted this kind of attack on elite universities in the entirety of American history. And so basically, like, just to kind of give an overview of what's happening without hopefully boring people too much, like you have the most visible and apparent thing, which is Trump focusing on, I think it's actually like 7 specific elite universities in the United States. And that's Harvard, Columbia, Brown, Cornell, UPenn, Princeton, and Northwestern University. And so the biggest like story that people are aware of is Harvard, in which basically the Trump administration has frozen $2 billion in federal grants, which are current grants, frozen $60 million in contracts with Harvard. And then they're also threatening to basically suspend or cancel as much as $9 billion in future grants with Harvard. With Columbia, which is also the big story that people are aware of, the Trump administration canceled $400 million in grants. And now Columbia, like they're kind of the two divergent stories in which like Columbia is trying to regain that funding, basically having conceded to the demands of the Trump administration. And then the rest of the remaining 5 universities, Brown, Cornell, UPenn, Princeton, Northwestern, all of them are being targeted for basically like multiple $billion of grants collectively. And it's kind of funny because a lot of these university presidents are not even being told directly by the Trump administration. They're like finding out through the news. So you'll be like watching Fox News, and then these presidents will be like, oh, like actually, like Trump is canceling all this money, but like they never told us. So they're finding out like not even directly through like talks with the Trump administration. So that's kind of like the most immediately visible thing. And then other things that have been happening is the education department has sent warnings to 60 universities that they're going to investigate them for quote unquote anti-Semitism. And then you also have like these other kinds of moves being made of like warnings being sent to a lot of universities of like, we're going to visit your campus and investigate anti-Semitic incidents on your campus and stuff like that. But going back to those like 7 specific elite universities, and like so you have the federal funding freezes, and then the other kind of planks of the attack by the Trump administration include attempting to revoke the nonprofit status of universities like Harvard, and to also revoke their tax exempt status. And I just want to like kind of give an actual like figures of like what this means. Where I found this article that was saying that between 2018 to 2022, so in a 5-year span, like basically the top 10 universities in the United States received a total of $33 billion in federal contracts, along with $12 billion in basically tax benefits. And at the same time, those 10 universities had their endowments grow by $64 billion. So this question of like, yeah, like why are taxpayers sending like $45 billion to these universities while their endowments are growing by even more than that? And so this is all part of this question of, yeah, like the tax exempt status, which is wrapped up in the federal funding. And then the other, what's been reported is the other kind of phase of the Trump administration's attack on the universities is targeting those endowments themselves and basically investigating what are these universities invested in? What is like actual like composition of their investment portfolios? And the kind of stated purpose of this is to investigate universities' ties to like China, for example, or like their investments in like ESG funding. But I think it's a lot deeper than that, because actually this is, what's interesting is that this is basically the demand that was made by the student movement last year, which was these universities need to actually disclose what they're invested in, especially with these gigantic investment funds. And yeah, like Harvard has a $53 billion endowment, Yale has a $42 billion endowment, Princeton has a $34 billion endowment, Penn's is $22 billion. And actually Harvard's endowment is larger than the economies of 120 countries. Like just to give us like the scale of the money that's kind of funneled into these universities. But so those are kind of the 3 main phases of the Trump attack, at least from what I've seen, which is, yeah, like the federal funding freezes, revoking the tax exempt status, and then going after the actual endowments themselves. And so, yeah, it raises the question of, yeah, like, why do these universities need so much money? What's the point of these endowments? And why do they need even more money from taxpayers when they're already so rich? And I think I just want to note that, like, at least how I see it, the issue is not even federal funding in and of itself as this kind of universal question. Like I was actually doing research on like, how do Chinese universities get funding? And like, I think this would be very obvious, but yeah, like most, like especially like the big Chinese universities, a lot of their funding comes from the state. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And so what we're really interested in is what does this funding mean in this particular state, in this particular country, and in this particular crisis of the United States? And so I think the big story that people have seen has basically been that Harvard I think about a week ago, they said that we're going to refuse the Trump administration's demands. They called these demands illegal. And so there's also this pending legal action of whether it's even lawful for Trump to cancel federal grants in the way that he's doing it. And so I think the narrative that people have been blasted with, including us, is like, you have this image of like the valiant, brave Harvard administration standing up to Trumpian tyranny in defense of free speech, academic freedom, all that stuff. And I think the kind of undercurrent of what's kind of unfolding is Harvard, and taking that stand against the Trump administration, counter to what Columbia did, is basically they're setting the barometer for what other universities, how they're going to react to the Trump administration. Because Harvard is like not just the richest university, but it's the most prestigious university in the United States. It is basically, when you think of the elite American university, Harvard is the ideal. And so I just want to say that like that's just an overview of what's actually been happening so far from what I've seen. and also like to just describe some of the like demands that were given by the Trump administration to universities like Harvard, just to like for like kind of factually is like some of the demands included like ending quote unquote the ideological capture of universities, dismantling the bureaucracy of diversity, equity, and inclusion, installing quote unquote viewpoint diversity in these universities with new faculty. And then I think that one of the things that people are really up in arms about is basically exerting direct oversight over specific programs that supposedly breed anti-Semitism. And then also the thing which I think people are aware of, which is basically enforcing harsher discipline on student activists. And so people can read all of that stuff in like the New York Times. It's like it's publicized like everywhere. But I think obviously for us, the big question becomes about discerning between these different narratives and these different like kind of struggles which are unfolding. And I think it's very important. I think we've said this before, but that for us, defending the students for their right to protest the genocide in Gaza is not the same thing as defending the universities, even though many people conflate those two and say that they're the same. Even if Trump thinks that they're the same, or like obviously people within the university will say, oh, it's all the same thing. And I think that it's also accurate to say that, like I think, or at least I think it's accurate to say that there are multiple agendas, multiple players involved in this attack on the universities, and in especially around like these elite institutions, and like also even this question of like repression around like activism against the war in Gaza. And the other thing I think that we need to like be clear on is distinguishing, and I feel this like a lot more this past week, distinguishing not just between the students and the universities, but also between the students and the faculty at the universities. And I think that's important because I've been thinking about it, and fundamentally the relationship that a lot of faculty have to their own universities is different from the relationship that the students themselves have to their universities. And I think that the faculty are basically trying to pull the students into a certain agenda, which is in their interests. So it is not necessarily in the interest of the students themselves. So I just want to lay that all out and then basically get into what has been like a large question which we've been basically working out for the past couple of years, which is what is the contemporary current American elite university? Like what role does it play? What is its place in American society? And actually like the quote that I was reminded of was from Baldwin's essay on white guilt, where he basically describes a place that produces, in his words, and he's quoting another book by Henry James, but unnameable objects and unspeakable crimes. And I think that part of what's interesting about this whole battle is that for the vast majority of people in the United States, the kind of inner workings of what's happening in these universities is a total black box. People have no idea what's happening. People can only see what they're told basically through like the New York Times, for example. But the actual inner workings of it are completely obscure to regular people. And that's happening even while, let's say, a university like UPenn is sucking up the resources of the city, is feeding on the labor of Black poor working people in the city, or even like the university that we went to, Cornell, feeding on the labor of like poor white people in upstate New York. And like all of these workers in the universities who are basically completely faithless and anonymous to the students themselves. And like, so you're having this like this university which like plays such a huge role in the economy of cities and in the makeup of what is prioritized in governance, and is also dictating the lives of people, and yet is completely unknown, or it's like makes itself obscure to ordinary people. And the other part of this is obviously what we've talked about, which is the elite university being part of the American state itself, by which we mean that set and network of institutions which are like governing society, managing American empire, and controlling the kind of realm of ideas and the discourse of ideas. And I think the other part of this, which like I felt a lot when you kind of feel it intuitively when you set foot onto these university campuses, but the university as kind of the torchbearer of Western civilization itself, and kind of setting the standard for what the meaning of progress is, whether for an individual or for society. And I think, we've talked about this a lot, but like kind of the paradigm that's set for all of this is the post-World War II era, the Cold War, in which the American university becomes enmeshed into this pact with the American state. And I just want to emphasize, it's not really just about scientific research, which I feel like a lot of people in the media and like even like university professors are saying like, oh, like Trump is threatening like the like Alzheimer's research, or he's threatening like polio research, all that stuff. But it's really much more about the university as this both a symbol for and an actual concrete global force for American power and hegemony. And in which even in that agenda, scientific research serves an ideological function of saying like, oh, like if you want to look for the leading edge, if you want to look for the most advanced civilization on earth, you have to look to the university, you have to look to the American universities, and you have to look to the American system. And I think as part of that, especially the current American university, the elite universities in particular, are basically factories for reproducing the elite. And this is not just about equipping people with technical skills, but I think like I see it as much more about how do you create a certain kind of human being who thinks a certain way. And I think we've talked about this before, but these universities are places where the elite consensus, the consensus among the ruling elite is basically formed. The ideology which dictates and kind of motivates the American ruling elite is created and is basically beat into your brain once you arrive on campus, which is you are the future leaders of society. Like I feel like all of us were, like many of us were basically told like over and over again, you are the future leaders of society. And so basically you see it as like your destiny to like lead and manage in like the government and Wall Street and weapons manufacturing and law firms, think tanks, nonprofits, like the media, like tech companies, like even like art and culture and museums, like the healthcare system. And then obviously also like the kind of rungs of both higher education and then like public education, K through 12. And I think another thing that we've said is that, or at least I feel very strongly, is that in this, one of the great crimes of the university has been basically to disfigure the souls of young people who enter into the university, in which it basically turns you into like a cynical, opportunistic, amoral person who's completely divorced from like the lifeblood of like the actual people who make up society and even like your own community or like humanity as a whole. And so as part of that, like I think especially today, this whole question of what a college education represents is basically like through the ideological remaking of this generation of young people and these parts of American society, it becomes a driving force in what currently constitutes, I think, the color line, even in American society itself, in which this question of like, oh, whether or not you have a college education or not dictates like what jobs you can have, dictates what your political preferences are. It dictates who you associate with and who you're involved with, where you go in the city that you live in, like even where you move in the country itself. And I think this is basically part of the kind of evolving fabric of what we even call the color line in American society. And I think the other part of this, which is I think pretty apparent, is that these elite universities are also kind of almost like a revolving door for the permanent class of the American ruling elite. So like an example of that is like Jake Sullivan, who was he the national security? I forget. Yeah. National security advisor for the Biden administration, who's now, and this is his direct title at Harvard, the Henry Kissinger Professor of Statecraft and World War. So this is kind of like this revolving door where it's like, you're in the government, you're in the elite, then you go to Harvard, then you go back to the government, back to Harvard, and it's kind of like this revolving door.
That's crazy.
Circulating
They just be
constantly.
making up shit, man.
And obviously, and it's not just domestically, but the other side of this is obviously like the neo-colonial elites of the darker nations of the third world, of the global south. All of them, when they want to educate their children, you send them to Harvard, you send them to Yale, you send them to Columbia. And like this is where not just the American ruling elite, also the elite of basically the darker world is being formed, trained, molded, and then you're sent back to your country to basically like manage your society. And I think connected to that, like the other thing that I think is important to note is that all of these elite universities and even like the less elite ones, they all have satellite campuses around the world. So like NYU will have like a campus in Shanghai or whatever, like Harvard will have all these campuses around the world. And actually I was thinking about it, and these satellite campuses of the elite universities in like Asia, Africa, Latin America are just as powerful as US military bases, if not more powerful as US military presence around the world, because these are the true centers of American empire exerting itself on the societies in which the American empire is attempting to rule and control and govern. And then the flip side of that is like, for instance, like when people in, let's say, like South Korea want to understand what's going on in American society, where do they turn? They have to turn to basically white academics and like professors from, all these elite universities. And so I think recently, like Judith Butler gave a talk in South Korea. Like whenever there's like these op-eds in like Korean newspapers about explaining what's going on in America, it's always these academics from elite American universities. And so I'm trying to like lay out like, the kind of architecture of all this. And then the other side of this too is actually examining, I was doing some research of like, where do people who graduate from like, let's say like Harvard or these other universities, where do they end up? And for Harvard specifically, like the biggest destinations of, let's say, where a Harvard undergrad might end up is basically finance, tech, consulting firms, and then the war industry. And I was looking at also like let's say like the top employers of, let's say, a Cornell graduate. Even though, and actually this is really interesting because like Cornell has its reputation of having a really prestigious like engineering program and an agriculture program. But actually the top employers of Cornell graduates are basically, I looked this up, it was Amazon, JP Morgan, Google, Cornell University itself, Goldman Sachs, Microsoft, Lockheed Martin, the weapons manufacturer, Ernst & Young, the kind of global corporate consulting firm, Facebook, and Deloitte. So these are basically where the universities, like all these, and that's not even just at like the Ivy Leagues, it's across the board for basically the biggest universities in the United States. Like I was actually looking at it for the 29 of the top universities in America, the top place that students end up is Google, and then that's followed by like firms like Deloitte, by Amazon, by Wells Fargo, the bank, by Northrop Grumman, the weapons manufacturer, by Boeing, the weapons manufacturer, the State Department. Like actually, it's kind of funny because the biggest feeder for Georgetown University is the State Department, which makes a lot of sense because it's in DC. And then the other side of this is that actually, when you think about it, this also connects to the discussion we had last week about deindustrialization, because it raises the question of like, why is the government subsidizing massively these universities, which are basically only really focused on churning out Wall Street people, Silicon Valley people who contribute nothing to society?
Right.
Like, what is the point of subsidizing these universities whose sole purpose is to basically churn out this endless stream of people who can, basically do produce nothing productive for society? And if you're involved in the manufacturing sector, it's only really in the war industry. And so I think this is also tied to, I think, things that we talked about a lot before, which I think Raj brought up recently, which is that over time, American trust and belief in higher education has plummeted, in which even within the span of, let's say, from 2015 to 2025, 10 years ago, 10% of people distrusted American higher education, and now that number has risen to 1/3 of American people having a complete, like basically total distrust in American universities. And so I think that raises the larger question of like, I think this gets to like the narrative of like, oh, the universities are standing in defense of democracy, when actually the universities themselves, regardless of Trump, are already probably the most anti-democratic force in American society. In which, if you think about it, it's like when you talk about the manufacturing of elite consensus, it's like even beyond the kind of conventional notions that we have of like of government, of the state, of the role of a citizenry in shaping legislation, all that stuff. Beyond all that, when you think about the ideas that are formed to dominate the direction of where society is headed and what is the future of the American empire and of society, all of this is being basically decided within the grounds of the university, completely removed from any semblance of democratic control by ordinary people and ordinary citizens. And I think this is like that to me is like probably the biggest point, which is that this whole notion that the universities are standing up for democracy is completely wrong and farcical, and basically, yeah, like is a fiction. It's a narrative invented by the universities themselves who are attempting to justify their own position in society, when in fact, like they are the ones who are the real anti-democratic force in American society as part of the kind of architecture of the American state. And so I just want to say that to begin, not even to begin, just as a part of it, and then also get to this question of, yeah, like anti-Semitism and free speech and war, in which, yeah, like you have, like Trump has set this like anti-Semitism task force to visit 10 universities, and like you have also have like all these other colleges which are being investigated for like DEI stuff. And so again, like, is this really about free speech? And I think for us, the answer is no, because the universities were already extremely repressive before Trump. And like this gets into like all the stuff we talked about last year with the first science conference, which is like whether you're in the humanities or you're in the sciences, like this question of like what you're allowed to question, what you're allowed to research, what you're allowed to debate and discuss, all of that is conditioned within the university. And this is everything preceding Trump. And all of it is controlled, all of it is dictated to you, whether explicitly or implicitly by the faculty, by the administration, by the people around you. And like, this is, I think this is, yeah, where this question of, oh, it's just about free speech or academic freedom. Like, yeah, I think it's a farce. And then this other question of like, is this about anti-Semitism? And Doc sent this article by, I think it's the president of Wesleyan University, who's Jewish, who's like, actually, and this is in the New York Times, he's like, actually, like we Jews in the American university don't want Trump to do this because actually in real life, Trump is not really protecting Jews. He's actually harming Jews in universities. And yeah, I think the lines of like this whole thing of like Trump protecting Jewish students and protecting Jewish faculty, like this is from the president of Wesleyan University himself, who's Jewish. It's like, he's saying, actually, no, this is a cover for a wider range of agendas that have nothing to do with the welfare of Jewish people. And Shimbartu sent an article that basically said the same thing in Foreign Policy magazine. And I think, yeah, it makes sense. And it's like, when you think about it, like all of like as quiet as it's kept, like, and also there's no actual, I actually tried to look it up, like, oh, what percentage of faculty at Harvard are Jewish? And there's no reporting on that because they're not allowed to disclose. Even while they have all this other data around like the racial demographics of the university, but the one demographic which is not allowed to be discussed is the percentage of Jewish faculty. But it's like, yeah, like I think everyone knows this. Like when you go to these universities, like, and I didn't realize this because I didn't even know like what Jewish people were.
Yes,
white people. When I first went to Cornell, but then yeah, then you realize over time that like, yeah, like all the faculty, the admin, like also obviously a lot of the students, like they're Jewish. Like, and even like Columbia, a huge part of the student body is Jewish. And so yeah, obviously like that, I think that's part of like the whole like underpinning of this and the narrative. But I think like for me, I do think it's so important to like actually still pay attention to like this whole question of Israel and Gaza being at least important to consider, especially in beyond the universities themselves and the Trump administration's attacks on the students. And my hunch about this, which may be wrong, is that I think in some way, in his own way, Trump, while he recognizes that he was only able to, like, let's say, win the 2024 presidency because of the anti-war vote, and because also his own movement has this huge anti-war base, I think Trump, this is just my conjecture, but that Trump actually feels insecure about things like this, the student movement, because basically he sees this as like an anti-war movement that he can't control. And like, especially an anti-war movement, which is parallel to like, let's say like MAGA. And I think like, interestingly though, like Trump himself, like, I don't think that he can really control even where his own base goes. So I think there's been this whole, I think like this whole controversy around, basically Israel and the MAGA base. And I think like a lot of people have talked about whether it's like Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, like there was this debate on Joe Rogan's show between this guy, Douglas Murray, who's this like really smug British neocon guy, and then Dave Smith, who's this libertarian American guy. Like, I do think if MAGA itself is going to break apart, I think Israel would be maybe the rock that breaks it apart. But I think going back to like, this whole student question, I think part of what's confusing about and complex about the whole situation is that I think actually, and I think Trump is doing this deliberately. Trump has kind of layered upon each other multiple questions, one of which is the student activists, like anti-war movement, the immigration question, and then the universities themselves. And I think in some ways that has made it easier for Trump to target, let's say, like certain student activists who are foreign students in the US, but also it's kind of made it easier for all of the liberals to rally behind, like now when you didn't care about Gaza at all, like throughout the entirety of the Biden administration, now it's easy for you to rally behind like Mahmoud Khalil, to be like, oh, like he's attacking immigrants, or like, oh, he's like threatening free speech and all that stuff. And one of the other undercurrents of this, which I think like I was thinking about, is that in some ways, like, and this is again my kind of interpretation, but you can trace the origin of the pushback to even the student encampments and the universities themselves back to the 2020 George Floyd protests, in which you have these images of like riots of in Seattle. There was like this autonomous zone that was formed, Chad,
Right.
that people have forgotten about.
Yeah.
And so I think in the minds of a lot of MAGA people, it's really easy to conflate basically, oh, the encampments are just like another continuation of like what happened in 2020. And so yeah, I just want to point that out or raise that. But I think the other part of this is that as the State Department has been revoking the visas of, I think now it's like, last I saw it was like around 800 international students, and basically claiming that their activities are counter to the foreign policy interests of the United States. I think the other part of this is that I think the university administration themselves are secretly glad that Trump is basically giving them an excuse to crack down harder on the student movement and basically to get rid of the student activists, even while they have this other kind of plank of opposition against the Trump administration. And so as part of that, like given all this kind of like multiple superimposing layers of like ideological and political questions, I think it's very, on the one hand, it's very understandable for, let's say, like students at Penn to feel very defensive against the Trump administration for kind of immediate and reactive reasons. And also this is kind of in the context of what I do think are Trump's own indefensible actions in like prolonging the genocide in Gaza and bombing civilians in Yemen and bragging about it on social media and bypassing Congress to send billions of weapons to Israel over the past couple months. But I think while I think it's understandable for a lot of students to feel defensive, I think like ultimately the students themselves are going to have to face hard choices and hard political questions, which is like, aside from this whole question of Trump, do you still see the university itself as the enemy? And are you going to allow your own future and your own political imagination to be dictated by what the university said as it's trying to protect itself? And I think actually, yeah, the phrase came to mind from King of like, in some ways, the students, this is probably a bad metaphor, but the students are in some ways bound to the immediate colony of time within the university. But what they have to discover is basically, yeah, the empire of eternity. They have to discover a calling for themselves, which transcends the 4 years that they're going to spend on the university campuses. And so that actually, so that brings me to like the other thing which I want to talk about, which is basically, like the legacy of the civil rights movement, of the Third American Revolution. And I think, like I said, a lot of the pushback against the universities, especially amongst the MAGA base, I think it started with, basically 2020, the George Floyd protests, and then kind of the high point of wokeness, postmodernism, the installment of these DEI bureaucracies in universities and corporations across the country, and basically the equation of that with the civil rights movement and the legacy of the Black freedom movement. And I think we've talked about this basically for the past 4 years, but like for us, like this whole question of DEI, of wokeness, of postmodernism was never really about defending Black people, but it's much more about the kind of homogenization of the ideology of the ruling elite and the desperate attempt by the American elite to kind of reclaim a semblance of moral legitimacy in the eyes of people by saying like, oh, like we are the inheritors of Martin Luther King. And I think like sometimes I think maybe we are not fully aware of, or maybe even underestimate the extent to which that moment, like that 2020 moment, basically triggered a huge reaction amongst like the MAGA, like that whole part of America, which is like the MAGA world, the Trump base, in which you've basically seen the creation of this whole political movement and like the media ecosystem as a counter to the whole woke thing. And so like one person that I've been looking into a lot this week was Christopher Rufo, who's kind of heralded as like the intellectual architect of what Trump is doing now against both higher education and public education. And I think interestingly, actually, he had this interview with Ross Douthat in the New York Times, which I recommend people listen to or read. And he actually admitted that his family are basically come from Italian communists in Italy. So not even like American communists, but like the Italian communist movement. And like what's interesting about all of this is that Rufo also published an article in I think it was in the Free Press, which is kind of like a Zionist media outlet, but basically saying that the right has to reclaim the mechanisms of civil rights law and the Civil Rights Act in order to basically counteract what they call the left has weaponized civil rights legislation in the name of wokeness and all this stuff. And so I think in the midst of all this, there's a lot of both hypocrisy and ignorance on all sides, but also, like it's really ironic because essentially what this means is that for especially like the kind of intellectual sphere of the MAGA movement, they are basically having to recognize and actually have debates around what is going to be their relationship to the Third American Revolution, what is going to be their relationship to not just the kind of architecture of the legal of law, which was constructed in the wake of the civil rights movement, but directly the legacy of people like Martin Luther King themselves. And so I think like as a result of this, there have been kind of like what I think are very weak, confused efforts to essentially create an alternative system of higher education. I think like in Austin, I think like Barry Weiss attempted to create this like University of like Austin or something. There's like anti-woke in Florida. They're trying to create an anti-woke university, and they're trying to like celebrate the classics of Western civilization and all this stuff. But I think a lot of it is basically confused. It doesn't really have an anchor. It doesn't really have a compass because they're not even like this movement itself doesn't really have a principal relationship to like the legacy of the Black freedom movement itself. And I think the other part of it too is like this whole accusation which is flung around by Trump oftentimes, which is like, oh, like these universities are filled with Marxist professors and all that stuff, which carries these overtones of McCarthyism. Actually, when you think about it, it's kind of true because like one of the people that that Rufo brings up in this interview with Ross Douthat is like, the one person who I recommend people read is Herbert Marcuse, because Marcuse is the one who coins this term of the long march through the institutions, in which you basically have like the Frankfurt School, like cultural Marxism, basically trying to embed itself in elite universities. And so in some ways, Trump is actually kind of accurate. You do have a lot of Marxists in the universities today. And there's this whole debate in like the MAGA movement about, should we try to copy the tactics of the left, of having our own Marxist institution, or should we try to basically create our own parallel institutions? And I think also part of this is like this whole debate around affirmative action. And I was reading Doc's remarks from 2023 when the Supreme Court ruled against affirmative action in elite universities. And I think what you brought up at the time, Doc, was basically after the kind of, in the wake of the civil rights movement and the assassination of King and the kind of severing of the actual revolutionary force of the civil rights movement, what you had was essentially a strategy to bring more Black people into the kind of ranks of the ruling elite and the managerial class of society, in which it becomes really, like this whole question of affirmative action is not really about the substance of equality of freedom for the majority of Black people who are poor and working class, but really about trying to bring in like whether you're Asian, Latino, Black, trying to bring at least enough people into the ranks of the ruling elite. But so I think again, like for me, what's interesting about all this is that people like Rufo even are being forced to concede that there is no going back to a status quo which is pre-civil rights. And you have to deal with America, which is post-civil rights. And this is essentially raising what we in the Free School have been like doing this whole time, which is trying to bring the battle over the meaning of the Third American Revolution and to rip it from the stranglehold of these elite institutions and to actually bring this question back to the people and say, how will the people define what is the legacy and the meaning of the civil rights movement? Yeah. And I think this also gets to like a debate and argument that we had in Lucian Blackwell Reading Group this past Tuesday about HBCUs, Black colleges, which is, like you point out, where student protests in the 20th century was born on the campuses of Black colleges, in which students not only sought an education to, like, you know, become like professionals, but really, like, this was like your story. You sought an education to become a freedom fighter.
Right.
The same story for people like Diane Nash, for, you know, like all these students at like Nashville. And even back then, like, you actually could rely or at least look to at least some of your administrators and faculty for like to protect you or to like actually nurture that spirit. And now you have a situation in which, yeah, like Morehouse, it's Morehouse, right? Morehouse College, which was the alma mater of Martin Luther King, inviting Joe Biden to give the commencement prior to the 2024 election while the genocide in Gaza was ongoing. And in which you have these HBCUs, which have become, yeah, like beholden both to a kind of almost like Booker T. Washington idea of skills training, and then, but even more importantly, funneling their students into the Democratic Party and into the apparatus of the state and all of its offshoots and nonprofits and all that stuff. And so all of this brings us to what is in effect like what is happening in this battle between Trump and the universities is, like we've said many times, almost like an eruption of the crisis of legitimacy of the state and by extension of the elite university. And ultimately, it's a battle over state power, I think, or you can argue that it's a battle over state power. And I think in that sense, like how I see even what Trump is doing and how Trump sees himself is that Trump recognizes in his own way the university as almost rival centers of power in the American system. And so he's going after them in the same way that he's going after the Supreme Court against like institutions like USAID, which are kind of the cultural soft arm of American empire. And I think it's an open question for me of whether or not Trump simply wants to kind of course correct the universities to make them kind of symbolically less woke, or whether he wants to disrupt and manage them, disrupt them and damage them fundamentally. And I think still in the midst of like whether regardless of what Trump wants to do, I think for us ultimately, like we still see it as the long game of the universities have to be brought down. And their stranglehold on young people, on the ideological life world of the American people has to be broken. And I think part of what I think has been beneficial with this whole thing with Trump is that I think for me, it's helped me to realize that whether it's Trump or any future movement, like any democratic movement of the American people, yeah, it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be clean cut. And there will be collateral damage. And it's going to be messy. And I think, yeah, like what's already happening in the universities is going to be part of the equation, which is, yeah, like people may lose their jobs. Like people in the universities may lose their jobs. I think we have to be serious about like that those are like, if you consider yourself a revolutionary and you consider like the possibility for revolutionary transformation of American society, even a nonviolent transformation of American society, like it is going to be messy, and there are going to be people who, like, I don't know if it's suffer, but they don't benefit basically from a fundamental and drastic change of the architecture of American society. But I think we see it, and this is, I think, like Roger has brought this up, Docu brought this up, but the elite American university itself has basically become this kind of moribund, imperial, authoritarian, and decadent structure, which is behaving more and more like the medieval Catholic Church, and is seen by the American people as morally bankrupt and politically illegitimate by growing sections of the American people. And so I think, like, obviously, I don't think that a serious ideological alternative has emerged via the university, especially at the national level. But in some ways, like this is kind of like where free school emerges from. Like basically going back for a decade, like free school, at least you can correct me on this, but like free school emerges out of the failure of universities and out of the, basically out of the attempt to sever students from the people and to sever, let's say, students in North Philadelphia at Temple from the community and the Black proletariat in North Philadelphia. And so I think actually like a while ago, or it's like 2 weeks ago, in the Ben Dunn group, we had read Of the Training of Black Men in Souls of Black Folk by Du Bois. And the way that Du Bois was talking about how he saw the role of the Black college, and especially in this period of coming after the counter-revolution of against Reconstruction, is in some ways like it felt very appropriate for even how we see ourselves and what we believe in. And I think like the way that Du Bois describes it, I think is very appropriate for us because yeah, like we believe like Du Bois does in yeah, like popular education, education for the people, for the masses of the people, regardless of what your educational background is, regardless of yeah, like where you're coming from. But even more than that, like, and this is again, I'm drawing from Du Bois in this chapter, but we also in free school believe in the social and like the resurrection of Black people, and in the regeneration of Black people and the American people as a whole. And I think we also believe in the creation of new and principled social relationships that break the color line and fashion new relationships, like basically in the city of Philadelphia. And I think above all else, like I think this, yeah, again, I'm drawing from Du Bois, but like I think we in free school believe that this time calls for the development and creation of new modern men and women who will fight for and work for peace and for the possibilities which are kind of pregnant in American society and in the world. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I wanted to end and just say like it made me reflect a lot on kind of the painstaking day-to-day work that we do in free school and our attempt to, yeah, like locally within the city of Philadelphia, but even beyond that, to try to, yeah, provide an ideological alternative, especially in the light of the crisis of the university and what the university has become in American society today. But yeah, that's kind of where I wanted to end.
Nice. Why are you smiling so much?
Sorry, I know that was a lot.
No, it was
good.
excellent. It was really excellent. I think that the way you connected so many dots and very, very impressive. And I'm just hoping you might write it up and have it published in Black Agenda Report somewhere. Somebody will invite you onto their podcast.
Really? After all that, yeah.
Yeah, because it's
That's true.
yeah, just I have certain things, if you don't mind. The essay in the New York Times by the president of Wesleyan University is quite instructive because he says that he is the first Jewish president of a Methodist university. By the way, which is not unusual. Jewish elites are now part of the American elite. And of course, while the University of Pennsylvania has had a series of Jewish and Jewish women presidents over maybe the last decade and a half, so it is not anything shocking to see Jews in these positions, which to me, decades ago, put the lie to the existence of anti-Semitism. There are no obstacles to Jews ascending to the highest positions within the society. And the only thing that awaits them is that there be a Jewish president. And probably that's not wrong. Sorry. That will happen sooner than later. So they used to publish the numbers of Jewish faculty and students at elite universities. And it had, I think at Harvard, for the elite across the board, which are the Ivy League and then the other kind of mainly research universities. But, and I would like to make a distinction between the Ivy League, let us say Stanford or Berkeley or the University of Michigan. I think there's a different mission and a different, I would say, purpose let me just say it right up, from the standpoint of Western civilization, which increasingly is dependent upon the US ruling elite. Europe is a museum of the past. America is the active creator, defender, and so on of the West, by which they mean Western civilization. And the Ivy League functions as that stronghold of civilization. The only other university I think that I would put in is the University of Chicago. But anyway, but American society has probably been, quote, cleansed of anti-Semitism decades ago. You all did not come up with any sense of experience with anti-Semitism, although all of you, given the universities and stuff that you went to, were around Jews all the time. And there was no complaint from any of your Jewish friends that we suffer oppression.
Right.
Just take the same situation with Black people. If you were around, even at Cornell or Harvard, you're around Black people for 5 minutes, the first thing they're going to tell you about, we are an oppressed people. The Jews don't have that narrative, and they know why, and everybody knows why. So I am thinking that this whole Trump thing, and so much of Trump is a wild and absurd performance with no substance, sound and fury, lacking any kind of substance. So he sets up an anti-Semitism department or agency or something to deal with anti-Semitism on college campuses. I don't think they found very much, maybe 1 or 2 students, along with the so-called organizations that defend the interest of Jews, the ADL or the Southern Poverty Law Center or some other the Federation of American Jews or whatever. But you go to a college campus and you ask a student, are you experiencing anti-Semitism? They say, what do you mean? I don't even consider myself a Jew. The only time I consider it is when my parents ask me but do the Jews consider themselves Jews anymore?
No.
But that's another question. But I think this was like a fig leaf or a veil to really obscure what the major attack was, and I think you got it right. It is an attack upon the elite, and once one understands the connection of these universities to the state, to the warfare state, to every war, and the Vietnam protest at Columbia, University of Chicago, and other universities over the war in Vietnam. And I just have to say this. We were talking in the Lucian Blackwell reading group. We're reading Martin Luther King's Why Oppose the War in Vietnam, which is about way more than Vietnam.
Right.
And so Ike Miller went to Morehouse. And he and I are very similar in this regard. Whenever the topic of Vietnam comes up, I get very angry. And I don't want to hear any BS from anybody about, well, this or maybe that. No, it ain't no this or that. I get very animated. I'm very angry, and I'm still angry to this day. It's not out of control, but I'm angry about it. The lies that were told, the people that died, Vietnamese, and those who suffer still to this day from the chemical weapons used against that nation, against that people. And of course, just a small thing again, we tried to understand what were the reasons for the assassination of Martin Luther King. And that assassination tells us more about America and the politics of America and the US state than the assassinations of Kennedy, either Kennedy or anybody else. If we understand the assassination of King, we can better understand American history and who Martin Luther King was. He could have waged urban campaigns against discrimination, housing discrimination, and poverty and slums. He could have waged other civil rights campaigns, let us say, against police brutality. None of that would have gotten him assassinated. The ruling elite in the state understood that this would be the big one. And it was. It brought the nation close, or as close as it could have been at that time, to civil war. It really did. But why? Why did they take that risk? It was over the question of war and peace. And the speech at Riverside was about American civilization, which had committed itself to war rather than humanity and its own people. And the universities, and I think, Jerry, you got it right on so many levels. First of all, they're guided not by morality, but by self-interest of the institutions, which means all of this government money. It's not to fight cancer, it's to wage war. It's not to fight poverty. You see what I'm saying? So we know that it is immoral at its core, that the elite professors who are part of running the university, it's not just the president or the board of trustees, it's kind of like a trifecta, the board of trustees, the administration, and the faculty. The faculty at Harvard is very powerful, very powerful. They can bring down presidents of the university, as they did with Lawrence Summers. Faculty brought him down over charges of inappropriate gender language or something, and they brought him down. So we cannot exclude the faculty. Most of the faculty, Jewish faculty, stood on the sideline and watched the students at Columbia assaulted by the police. You just, but if I could just, my final point is this, and I think you're right. Maybe later, if we have time, I'd like to quote from David Brooks's article. It is very, first of all, I put a lot of respect on his name because he is clear, he is to the point. And what he says is that, we have this situation where we're asking law firms to fight Trump, or we're asking universities to fight Trump, or we're asking this sector that Trump is attacking to fight Trump. He said, no. He says, what we're asking Bernie Sanders and AOC to fight Trump. He says, no. He said, this is a matter of Western civilization. The attack upon the university, frankly, is more than a political attack. It is a civilizational attack. Whether Trump understands it or not. I mean, for him, it is attacking elites that tried to prevent him from winning and really wanted to put him in jail, to destroy him. And he's right about that. The elites at universities, university professors, play a decisive role. Everything we see that's wrong, including gentrification, including deindustrialization, just the whole, they have stood not on the sideline and watched it happen. They have helped to develop it. And oh, by the way, I wanted to say about Jake Sullivan and these people who go from government to universities. It's like they're like the government that is not in power. It is the shadow government. You know what I'm saying? So there's no question about it. The universities are, quote, the Democratic Party and are, quote, and this is quotes by liberal. So, I mean, there's no question. You go to Harvard after you were in the Democratic Party administration, and you go to Harvard for rest and relaxation, you know, to prepare you to re-enter the battle again. And that's Jake Sullivan. But again, I just want to underline this, that the universities are, in effect, the last stronghold of civilization. And what David Brooks is saying, Trump does not understand fully the consequence of what he's doing. If he does, he has committed the highest act of treason in American history, from their point of view.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? If he knows what he is doing, they have to at some point call for him to be arrested and charged with treason, probably on other issues, but at the essence of it, he could bring Western civilization, which means the power of the United States, down. And in a sense, the elites have a strategy, I think, of let him shoot his best shots. Hold back, hold your guns. Let's see where he goes from this. Let's see if he self-destructs in the process or destroys his own movement or splits so many people from him that he's unable to govern. But let's hold off because they understand how fragile Western civilization is, which makes a lot of sense for the music conference, because one of the arguments we make is that there's always an alternative civilization and an alternative modernity.
Right.
We say it's there. This third American Revolution, it was about civil rights on the surface, but it was about much, 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 much more, you know. They understand, I think, how fragile the American state is, how fragile Western civilization is at this time. And they, when they look at those numbers of what people say about the future of the country and the way they politically behave and their anger of the masses, they understand that unless they control the narratives, all of the narratives, unless they have, as you call it, a narrative hegemony, the whole thing could collapse. It's that fragile. And an internal fight like the one that Trump is engaged with, if the ruling elite are not careful, it's one of those fights where we all lose it in their mind, where the whole thing could come down. And it's true, it's very fragile because it does not have a mass base of support. It's not there. Nobody defends universities, even though they say, oh, but Trump is cutting off money for us to do cancer research, and he's cutting off money for us to do diabetes, and he's going to endanger so many lives. Well, wait a minute. These people didn't just start dying. You have all of these medications, can't nobody afford it. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, and I just want, this is connected to the attack upon China. Yes, it is an economic, 245% tariff. Well, why don't you just take it up to 1,000? Just keep going. Let's see how far you can go with this. It said to me, in the end, because everybody's saying economically China will win, or economically we're going to hurt both sides, the economic arguments, which to me points to the inadequacy of economic or political economic analysis to explain a huge historic moment. You can hear the podcast, but I won't go. This is way more than an economic war between two nations. It is, in fact, a civilizational confrontation. The Chinese know it. They know it in their bones. They know something that even most Chinese might not be able to articulate. That this is an attack upon the very ground of our being, of what gives meaning to us, whether I got a job or don't have a job, whether, I'm doing real good or not. You want to deprive me of a sense of my own being and what gives meaning to me and my civilization in this world. That was the deep seek. We got it going on. We control all AI from over here. We're gonna make sure that China never get it. And we, all that big woolly talk. And then boom, here come deep sea. We did it for 5 million. It took y'all 500 million. So but anyway, that says something about the education system, elite universities. But that was another wake-up call in the civilizational confrontation. This is, as is the case with the universities, is the case with China. The Americans will and cannot, they can win an economic war. The chances of them winning that are better than them winning a civilizational war with China. And I think that's why Xi Jinping and others in the Chinese media are saying, hell no, you ain't gonna do this. We cannot. As they said, they said we will fight to the end, but they never say what the fight is.
Right.
And they never say what the end is.
Right.
So you got to do your own interpretation. You know what I'm saying? And the fight is civilization, and the end is which one will survive.
Right.
The process that we once saw, during the Cold War and the World Communist Movement is we saw a revolutionary process in the world where gradually the former colonial nations would become independent and find ways to restructure the world economy and world democracy. You know what I'm saying? The danger of US imperialism, but this world majority. I think as we go forward, the knowledge conference, the music conference, we are looking at the real possibility of a sudden collapse, which throws the country into any number of possibilities, long and short term, including ungovernability, civil war, and the potential of a revolutionary takedown and transfer of power. I think that's what I want. And I gather that my thinking on this comes directly from your presentation, which I really appreciate, man.
Yeah, this was like I wanted to say that I think like what you both were talking about was really important, and I think it clarifies because we've been talking about from last week to see all of this and the attack on the university in terms of the short and long game, and in light of the intent unintended consequences. And like I wanted to start by uh, like what you're talking about, this whole the shift in what the US university is, like post the second World War and the creation of this consensus, and how like to really understand the role of the university today. It also means it also I think God itself, and like Jeremiah mentioned. Like yeah, this like these articles coming out here about like what you were also saying, the Wesleyan University, and how nobody really believes that this is about anti-Semitism. And honestly, like looking at like articles that come out of more hawkish centers of war, like foreign policy, foreign affairs, stuff like this. I think they're refreshingly honest because they are not I think confused about what all of this is about. They don't feel the need to hide behind this veil of anti-Semitism, and they clearly talk about how deep this relationship goes between the university and war. And I've been looking at some of these like articles that are coming out, and they sort of go back to the history of even like from the like the late I guess the late 19th century, talking about the naval war college and all of this, like really saying that war was never, or modern war was never meant to be divorced from knowledge and education. It was always like this was meant to be the purpose, but then the university was like the university still remained a separate center for knowledge, and then the way war would go ahead, and citing the creation of Naval War College. And I think the West Point and all of these institutions, they sort of talk about them as isolated instances where expertise and knowledge is sought to be brought in the war making enterprise. But then post Second World War and the Cold War, this was really solidified. What like you guys are also talking about, this relationship is solidified, and like really the creation of the National Security Council and all of these come directly out of. I mean, I hadn't. It's refreshing because we sort of talk about these things, but it's good to like it's really chilling to read the extent to which the university is entrenched in this post Second World War, and this is also something that is, I mean, it's almost perpetually being hidden. It's perpetually being hidden under different kinds of narratives, and now anti-Semitism, and now about now it's going to be about like in protecting like all kinds like in identity politics, and this kind of rights and so on, sexual rights and all of this stuff. But I think really it's I mean, I'm saying that this is about war so much because what they also talk about is that war is not simply a matter of how we typically understand of like war as hot war or so on, because what they want to say is that this whole like the whole post World War II like order, it hinges upon critical and like expert guided decisions about when you're supposed to go into war, when you're not, when you're supposed to go into financial war, when you're supposed to how you're supposed to study how different societies are actually functioning, how do you identify their weak points, how do you identify when a society, a foreign society is susceptible to like counter revolution and so on. And really like what you were saying, Jeremiah, about the creation of these like these satellite campuses all over the world, it really first made me think about Bangladesh a lot. Because recently we had, it was the most recent color revolution like thing, and like Bangladesh has a lot of ties, not just through its current, I don't even know if he had the president Mohammed Yunus, but not even just him, who is like a direct recipient of all kinds of accolades from the US university. But you also have like in many universities which are directly like campus, like offshoots of US universities, and the role that they play is never talked about. It's never something you're allowed to ask. And I think it makes it very clear that the functioning of the war also involves how you understand different societies, different civilizations, their history, their, like their social making, their weak points, all of which is, I mean, it is part of, and probably the essential part of the knowledge that is studied by the university. And so, yeah, and like this was like, I think what you're saying about the university and the war consensus is indispensable, because there is no other way that we can understand the place the university has here. And like, when seen through this, like when you know the context of it that you guys were laying out, it makes all the sense about how we talk about Trump. And even, I mean, yes, his how he has, like where he is right now, all of the other, like him going, like, bombing Yemen and so on and so forth. All of these are, you have to see them as part of the broader, like probably intended goal of the administration. And like even I think sometime earlier this month, he fired the like the chief of NSA and like NSA and the Cyber Command, some guy called Timothy something. But all of this, like the way that the war hawks will talk about it is that what Trump is doing is really to ensure that the war enterprise is no longer connected to the university. And what they are concerned about is, okay, like tomorrow we are going to go to war with China or with somebody else. That's the whole, that's the ideological end goal of white supremacy. And when we go into that, we better be prepared by the knowledge of our university. We cannot afford this distinction, because then then we're going to fuck up. And I think it makes it very clear that the university as we know it, like what it champions as its knowledge and how it's trying to shape society, and like the whole progressive narrative about it, it really has to be questioned, because I mean it's laid out when you look at the history of the university in the last 80 years. And the other thing I also thought was very important was, yeah, I mean, the civilizational question. I think that is something that none of these, commenters directly want to talk about. And I think in our understanding, and what we've been doing for the last year or so, more than that, as the university being like really the pillar on which Western civilization stands. And I think what you said something about like the creation, like yeah, like really like what what the university is creating is a class of almost like modern missionaries whose role is to go out into the world and really to talk about what of the progress of the West, and really I think we understand the West in more complete ways, because it's not simply about like, I think that's what you were also saying, the color, like the modern color line, it doesn't look exactly like it looked 100 years back. And the project of the West, the project of white supremacy now, is to include as many non-white faces in its ranks. So therefore, like what are the standards, what are the values that the university is trying to produce, so the generation of young people is supposed to produce, and what are their like life's purpose going to be. Yeah.
Interesting. Like a few things. One of which is I think like this question of civilization. I think you guys are right that it's really important. In part because both sides, you can say both Trump and people like David Brooks are saying we're the ones who are defending Western civilization. Trump makes the civilizational argument, and a lot of people in like the MAGA sphere make the civilizational argument, but also people who are actually part of the ruling elite make the same civilizational argument. So the question is, who's actually more right? Is that they're really defending Western civilization? And I think that is in some ways an open question, in part because of like this whole thing with China and Trump and China and all that. But I think the other thing I wanted to bring up was like around this whole question of war and like the obscuring of the war agenda in a lot of ways by the universities. It's like something that I feel like we went through a lot was like, we're both very interested in like Korea, for example. But it's like you go to like a university like Cornell, all of the so-called area studies departments, all of them are basically Cold War projects. They're all created in the environment of Cold War because what you're really interested in area studies is like, oh, like let's say like I'm interested in North Korea. Literally the only scholarship that's available on North Korea is like people at like security studies institutes or like literally war colleges and stuff like that, where it's like we're gonna study North Korea in order to basically do like intelligence so that we know like how to bomb them. We know like how to like dismantle their society. And it's like very like jarring. You're like, oh, like I want to understand, yeah, like I want to understand like the world, and it's like really like the only people really who are interested in like area studies, which is like Asia studies or Latin America studies, ultimately people who like are funneled into like the State Department and are funneled into like the CIA, like literally into the CIA sometimes. And I don't know. I feel like it's like, yep, it's not like it's not for me. It's not just about whether or not you get hired by like Boeing or like BAE Systems or any of these weapons manufacturers. It's much more about the ideology that drives war in the first place, which is even more important than simply the weapons manufacturers themselves. And I think that's the part which is obscured from the rest of the American people, and yet that's the part which I think the American people are rebelling against in some ways. But yeah,
Jerry, could you just help? How does Trump or people associated with him make the civilizational argument?
yeah. I mean, I feel like it'll be like people like Rufo and then others who I'm aware of. They'll say, "Oh, like the postmodernism is an attack on Western civilization, and therefore we need to return." This is just this is the kind of language they use. It's like we need to return the university to its original mandate as the kind of torchbearer of Western civilization by being like, "Oh, like we need to return to the classics. We need to return to the great works of Western literature, even in like humanities." In that, like that's kind of the way that I see it. It's like their narrative of themselves trying to course correct university away from basically postmodernism, which they see as like almost an attack or threat, like a ideological attack against Western civilization. At least that's kind of what I understand.
Like I think actually, I think recently Trump met with the Italian president, and like they also sort of talk about it in the same terms about how the last 50 years or like the last few decades or all of this has been, it has been an attack on the legitimacy of, like Western civilization. But I think what they're trying to say is that we're trying to go back to, I think this is what you also say, that like going, like, almost walking backwards towards the past, which doesn't exist anymore. And we see that I don't even know if this is like this should be taken entirely at face value, but I think they try to say that, oh, we're trying to go back to a time where we could, like the whole project of Western civilization was not tarnished by the history of slavery and the history of what it has done to the world.
I think just in this calculus on the two sides, the Trump people cannot make a plausible civilizational argument.
Right.
The universities, and they've been at this for a long time.
Right.
So they have more ammunition. Because I think ultimately, to defend against Trump, they have to make the civilizational argument, as David Brooks does. And he's very sophisticated. I've only seen this guy in passing, Rufo, yeah, and I haven't really read him that much. But my point is this: I think they're right that MAGA people, that Trump himself is not up to the task of defending, quote unquote, Western civilization. That, and that's what I'm saying. they make a cut. Well, let's not be drawn into the fight that Trump wants us in. That's probably how Colombia made its calculation. Okay, is that all you want from us? So we can get this 400 million. Well, we can do that. More repression against the students. The student campus guards can arrest students, and we're going to lock down on anti-Semitism. So they gave in. I don't know that he made any more threatening claims against Harvard. And even if he does, they could weather the storm.
Yes.
But the thing is, to get into that kind of fight could be so damaging to all institutions.
Right.
And thus, the material architecture of Western civilization. Because if it can't be defended here, it certainly is not going to be defended in Europe. And see, this just my last point. This thing with China, they are quote competitor, but we have to do business with them. The United States is a large market, but the potentially largest market in the world is China. And if you wish to do business in the world economy, you have to do it with China, among other places. But that's just one side. The real question is, can Western civilization and can the American elite be the final defenders of Western civilization against China? And this, I think puts everything in a larger context, because the strength of their civilization determines the strength of their economy, the strength of their political system. And do they and their universities have something to offer the rest of the world in the face of the retreat, ultimate collapse of Western civilization to win Asia and Africa? The only Asian nation, well, maybe more, but the big Asian nation that went completely with Western civilization is Japan. And we see what that has led to. So the Chinese have a case to be made in Asia. Now, in terms of Asian elites who will uphold the West, well, it's India more than Japan. They're looking to India. And this is one reason I began to think the Indian elite are having a very difficult time deciding what side of the civilizational future they're on. I was of the opinion, and still am, that Modi and them are responsible for the coup in Bangladesh. No way that should have happened. But they did not want to be seen as going against Western democratic values. They could have stopped that with the quickness. But they had to perform for the West. And, and it sent a message throughout Indian elites that you have a future with the West, that you have a future in the United States, that the American universities are the best and greatest universities. Why should India, after these thousands of years of exporting one of the major cultural values of China, Buddhism, among other things, and then that, Tagore, and so, no, don't look to that history. No, we are now allied to the great civilization, the great foundation of modernity. And I think the Indian intelligentsia, the Indian state, is going to have to address this head on because they've kicked the can down the street too long and they've let this thing get out of control. I don't know who runs India these days. What is the Indian university? What do Indian elites think? And they're mainly educated in the United States. I don't think very many are educated in China, or whether there's a rich linguistic culture of Indians speaking Chinese, but the Chinese are speaking English, or maybe even Hindi. But you see what I'm saying? Why this? But anyway, let me stop there. In this India, and that's why Indian civilization will decline in importance for people throughout the world. People are not going to be running to India talking about, oh, well, we want to study Indian Buddhism. You know, oh, we want to study we want to study Hinduism. You know, nobody is saying that. I don't think there's a rush to Indian universities. There, if you look at the list of the 10 or so top universities, 8 of them are Chinese. The other 2 are Americans. So are the Indian intellectuals satisfied with this being a support? You know, are they Western? Are they so Western that they're no longer Indian, Hindu, and they no longer see a future in Asia, but a future aligned to the West and to the Americans? It is, yeah. Is that too harsh or too?
No, I mean, I don't know how to immediately, because, it's a personal question also,
Yes,
right?
yes, of course.
But I think what it reminds me of more than anything is also something I was getting at last time, which is if you look at how this consensus has carried on for 80 years, despite the fact that its authority or what it bases itself on is very fragile, is very fragile. It does not come from the authority of the people. It does not come from the authority of the truth. It cannot even be rationally explained, its modes of operation sometimes. And yet it has managed to persist for 80 years and successfully undone the revolutionary struggles, not just in this country, but even in a country like India, where the elite is in some ways cut off from the legacy of the freedom struggle, from the legacy of Nehru and Indira. And I don't disagree with you that that's what we're contending with right now. But I feel like everything else that's happening in the world right now with BRICS, and you also see, the attempts at a rapprochement between India and China, I think that is also in response to a certain change in world affairs where a counter revolution or a defense against a counter revolution is finally possible. And what I was thinking of, I mean, the Bangladesh thing is also very sensitive because, like Shambarto was saying, I was also, when we were talking about the neoliberal elite, even in Asia and Africa, you think about this person, Muhammad Yunus, the interim president of Bangladesh, his entire authority, I completely agree, is because of he got the Congressional Medal and the President's Medal and has a Nobel Prize. But then if you really try and investigate what these accolades actually mean in terms of scholarship, but also what you're contributing to the people, there isn't very much. So something that flimsy is still sufficient to overturn the legacy of an entire freedom struggle, to take down the leaders of that freedom struggle, burn, Mujibur Rahman's statue, humiliate, Sheikh Hasina, and so on and so forth. But that's what we are contending with. And one of the other things is, it's really, it almost infuriates you to read these accounts on the New York Times who are trying to describe Trump's attacks on these universities, Harvard, whatever, as such a big threat to, research, like you guys were saying, on cancer and Alzheimer's and so on, when you know that the healthcare system is a criminal system in this country. Even if you make any progress towards, actually giving people the benefit of medical research, you'll sell it at a 400%, 600% markup. So it won't ever be affordable by anybody but the super rich. But then also Harvard was where napalm was invented.
Yes.
And then when they, like, and the atom bomb, that's the character of the university, the atom bomb, napalm, that is what the university is about, not medical research. And it's almost shameful that these people even have it in them to talk about medical research as to why people should care about the university. And the other thing I was thinking about in all of this is also how to see the left in all of this, because I think, there is some dumbness in, how, like, I think Trump, when he talks about wokeness and the left in the university, he's not entirely wrong, but he's also not entirely right when he clubs in all these student movements, which we see as this great moral stand taken by these young people against not just the university, but the very fact society and politics, to say that no, we are not going to stand for this. Like, we are not, we as Americans, we cannot stand by while we bomb these children in Gaza. It's the moral stand. You cannot just lump all of that together with wokeness and leftism or whatever you're saying, anti-Semitism. It doesn't even make sense at this point. But then if you really think, the other question I also have is, what is the left? Like, what is the presence of the left in these universities? Because whether or not Trump gets it right, there has to be some clarity, because I think everything is being conflated to call Trump a fascist at the end of the day. But then if you think of the American university, everything you guys were saying about how the character of the American university for the last 80 years was defined by what it became through the Cold War. And that was in direct opposition to the Soviet Union, the Soviet Academy, and all these anti-colonial struggles, which had a view to use science and knowledge for peace, for nuclear disarmament, and so on and so forth.
No less indeed.
Yeah, and all of these people, that's what that world communist movement represented. And that's the place that knowledge and science had in all of that. And the American university was a counter, its character was developed as a counter to that. So when you think about how much the left has conceded or capitulated to the university right now, it really makes you ask the question of what of the left even remains in the United States. Because they are coupled to academia now more than ever before. And yeah, I mean, they're not very different from any of these academics in terms of knowing the people, actually, having something to say to what people are dealing with right now. If you really say that for people who, can't buy groceries, cannot have homes, the main thing they should care about is, their identities or pronouns or whatever. I don't understand. I mean, I just have a lot of jumbled thoughts, but yeah.
Well, I wanted to go back to the thing about the university students, because there is like one part of what you were. Oh, okay.
I was gonna bring that up though. I was excited to see
Oh, really? Okay.
that feeling.
Okay, I can read some comments. Michelle Bell, Bambala, and Sparks. Kansas Mama, I'll say good morning. Universities as the promulgators of the ruling elite. Kansas Mama says, these state officials, the government officers that go into high positions in big pharma at the NIH or CDC or something, all in a legal cycle. Wow, universities are feeding them. Blaze says that she's coming in fit, but he's watching the stream, and then everybody said that they hope he feels better. Says, yeah, I was just echoing the thing of the universities having the international campuses and satellite bases of indoctrination. And then Tim's mama says, even in high school, they dictate your thoughts. My daughter did debate, and they made all protections for her.
Right there.
The government's lied about everything, all the wars, all the assassinations, everything's got to change. And then Bombalite and Sparks were talking about the American soldiers who were messed up in Vietnam, how they have uncles and their father is a Vietnam vet. And someone named Sean Young says, I was brought here by a very intelligent, important man. Happy for what y'all going on. And then let's see. That's basically the chat. Oh, and then Michelle Bell says, the research angle on universities is a farce. Just like the claim that last week's Blue Origin flight was an all-female scientific mission. That was, yeah.
Well, I wanted to look at the university students more closely as basically a motive or a central force, like a human or an ideological or historic force that's moving between all of these different institutions, or like all of these institutions that you're describing. And the dots that you connected was really helpful. But there was like a few things that you had said that stuck out. And it was when you had made a distinction between the undergraduate students with the faculty. But then I would even further that distinction where I think they're also separate from like employees of the university. They're separate from grad students. They possess a unique quality. Like I think the clearest ideological leadership of the student encampments a year ago was driven by the graduate students. And there's something that I'm trying to understand about it. And I even want to say that I think there needs to be like a larger, deeper sociology about the student encampments, because like hearing you talk and then our discussion after, what I want to say is that I feel like the substance of the encampments a year ago, it is very different from like, let's say the encampments, like the autonomous zones in Portland, like during Black Lives Matter. I feel like the logical conclusion of what the students were moving toward was basically a peace movement. And there has been like a concerted effort to basically distort or change what the soul or the real striving of that movement was. And I feel like it was an unfulfilled logical conclusion because like where the students were going was a place where they were saying, I don't want my education to be related to genocide. Like, I don't want my education to be like, if this is what knowledge is for, if knowledge is war, then this is not knowledge. And I feel like where they could have gone or where they would have had to gone was a complete break with the university. Whereas the way the Gaza protests have been appropriated is like totally missing the war question at this point, or the question of peace, because I feel like I'm not saying it the best, but I also say that because just from my own observations, I feel like the students who were most like morally driven, not even students that I would label as activists per se, but like morally compelled by the question of peace in the original encampments, are not as relating as much to the reappropriation of the Gaza protests as effectively an anti-Trump campaign. And like, I basically don't think those students are being captured in a movement anymore. But what they would be captured in is the building of a movement in which something like the poverty you see in Philadelphia, the deindustrialization as a consequence of the war economy, is connected to like the total lifelessness or the total abstraction of the knowledge that they receive in these universities. Like basically stitching together all the dots that you were putting out into like the single banner of a peace movement is what I feel like needs to be presented to the students, and that broadly is the next stage of the movements that the students could take up. And this is something that Emily had also been saying, or like what you had said earlier this week had also made me think that when you had seen a pro-Palestine academic speak at Villanova, because the last thing I wanted to bring in is,
Could you just expand upon that, the pro-Palestinian academic?
well, what I'm saying is that the counter-revolution against, or the regression against the student movements a year ago is to basically fuse the pro-Palestine project with the academic project, which I do not think ideologically was what was originally driving the students. And I think it's significant to say that because people can talk about the war between Harvard and Trump, but what is not accurately being captured anywhere is, I think, how a lot of the general population of students are actually reading this. And for example, just from what I feel or what I see at Penn, I don't think that the majority of them are hostile against Trump's attack on the university and the withdrawing of 175 million from Penn, because how does that actually affect the life world of an undergraduate student who it does, like, it would affect the life world of people who are employed or professors or researchers. But for the student, the much more pressing question is like, why am I in despair? Why do I not understand my place in the world? Why do I feel like I have no option but to become an elite, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And then the last thing I wanted to bring in is I thought it was really valuable when you brought back in the origins of free school as like identifying the crisis of the university, because I know that even on our free school website, even to this day, like it begins by saying like we see the crisis of the university and we see the necessity of basically fusing education back with the pursuit of truth, which is the pursuit of freedom. And the way that you had described the purpose of education as to become a freedom fighter, I think is the task that these students must come back to. And it does involve the question of peace. There's just a lot of things that was like clicking in my head from this conversation. And I say like a sociology of the student encampments because I do think that that was an achievement that a full retreat is not possible from. Like a qualitative movement forward in the consciousness of the students. And our conversation made me realize that that needs to be defended more seriously of what was actually changed in the minds of the students. And I think it was a willingness or a preparation to actually fuse to fuse education with the project of peace.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Salida talk and what I told you, because like actually I really relate to like Doc when you're like, I get so agitated when people talk about Vietnam, like the Vietnam War, because I like am increasingly getting so agitated by basically activist academics. And actually the talk, so Samir and I went to Stephen Salida's talk at Villanova, and he gave another talk at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where the Du Bois Center is located. They have all these papers, and they have an annual James Baldwin lecture. And Salida was the talk this year, and like I was just very disappointed because actually going to the talk on Monday and seeing the complete moral cowardice of someone like Salida, and then the professor who invited him at Villanova, Gabriel Rockhill, who's like a Marxist professor associated with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, is so motivated. On the other hand, it just completely confirmed to me the awe I have for the way Trump is attacking these universities. Like for me, it in some ways brought me to another level of like it clarifying something to me of Trump versus Harvard, because I think that Monday was when it came out that Harvard, like everyone was saying Harvard University makes a great stand against fascist dictator Trump. First of all, when did Harvard University with a $50 billion endowment ever become a champion of democracy of the people at all? When in the history of the United States was Harvard ever considered a symbol of the people? Ever. In fact, they started before the United States was even born, because exactly in their place in the history of the United States is an example of private education, private New England education. That is the symbol they are. That is what they symbolize. And that ideological twisting narrative of Harvard being the champion of democracy versus Trump confirmed to me more that actually Trump, whether he's intending it or not, is doing more to not just attack liberalism, but to attack Western civilization itself, whether he intends it or not. But Trump is attacking Western civilization through his attack on the universities. And it is honestly pretty awesome, not in the like Gen Z definition of awesome, but like awesome in the like Webster's dictionary definition of awesome. It is awesome to see this happening with my very own eyes. To see, honestly. And actually, I would even say, once you realize that the current American university, the way it's intertwined with the state and the war economy, with the war state, with its roots in McCarthyism, the more awesome it becomes, because you're like, wow, Trump, whether he intends it or not, is actually the one person is finally undoing what happened to the American university because of McCarthy, beginning with McCarthyism. Like all the liberal academics who James Baldwin and King, who basically said they were down with civil rights, but then when it got scared with the Vietnam War, we're like, actually, I don't know if we're down with you. All those liberal cowards, all those white liberals, Jewish socialist cowards who ended up joining the academy and create the elite of the academy today. It is Trump who is basically like, yeah, I am going against you. It is Trump who is actually like cutting at the knees this consensus that you were describing, Jeremiah, this center of power, the main center of power of American civilization. And it does bring in the question of students, like Michelle, you were saying, because you have to see all of this as a civilizational crisis.
Right.
Because the question for the students, and we said this last year with the encampment, it is a civilizational question that the students are confronting, which is, it was the first great brave step was them, do you see the university as your enemy? Are you, like, we saw the students as opposing university, but we're at a point where it's not just about the university anymore, but it's about what is your stance on the future of American civilization? And I guess a concrete way of saying this is like, the next step all students and young people who come out of universities like us have to ask is what I would want to ask a Penn student, for example, is, okay, we're in the midst of a civilizational crisis. How are students asking, no, you don't have your professors anymore to give you guidance. You don't have celebrities. Are you asking the real question that you have to ask, which is, how does a Black poor person in Philadelphia see the world? What values and categories and criteria of knowledge does an ordinary Black person in Philadelphia, how are they operating? That is the education they should see, which is also why I completely agree why actually you describing the origin of free school is so clarifying, because the very easy, it's not easy, but the very important next step is always, what is the alternative?
Right.
And I'll even say, you don't even have to ask, what is a Black worker thinking? You can even ask, what is a white worker thinking? Like, how is a Black worker or a white worker in America, the ordinary American person, what is their criteria and what are their values of progress, of beauty, of knowledge? That is the alternative education that a young person should be seeking out. Like, if you are to say, I'm making a break from university. And I feel like that's where I want to bring in Steven Salita, because in some ways, there's some things he says, right? The title of his talk is The Life and Death of American, No Resurrection, The Life and Death of American University. And like, actually, Samir asked this question. I was like, I honestly went into that. Into Villanova, being like, first of all, I was like, oh, this is what a Jesuit college looks like. It's a Catholic university. My sister went to a Catholic university. I was like, there's statues all over the place of like Christian compassion and stuff. And I was like, oh, so interesting. Very, very pristine, very beautiful. I could not believe that this renowned Marxist Gabriel Rockhill teaches at such a like beautiful Catholic university and is like a radical and stuff. And then I thought we were just I'm always expecting to just be fake, because I feel like I'm used to like seeing how things are and just being like, okay, I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to observe, do sociology, and then leave. And immediately after Steven Salita's talk, where he didn't really talk about the death of the American university at all, like immediately he was like, any questions? And Samir was like, oh, I have a question. I was like, are we really good at ask questions? And Samir was like, yeah, so like I'm part of a revolutionary organization that like believes in the death of the American university. And my question is, like, at what point is the American university irredeemable? Because Samir was like, because, you know, here we are at an American university talking about the death of the American university, but not really. So at what point is it irredeemable? And are we going to actually go basically create an alternative education? Go to the people rather than being here. And Steven Salita said, I'm not comfortable ever saying we should go away from the university.
We should have what?
I'm not comfortable saying we should ever depart the university or break from the university. And it kind of just showed me like he's a very prominent figure in the Palestinian solidarity movement, because he was so abused and punished by multiple American universities for speaking up for Palestine. And for him to say that was just crazy to me, that he's still on his hands and knees wishing that he could have an opportunity to come back to an American university.
He's in Lebanon?
He's in Cairo, Egypt, yeah. And for someone who is very clear in his talks about the contradictions and hypocrisy of the American universities, someone who was punished by that hypocrisy, for him to not have a vision or an imaginary of alternative is also because he talks a lot about the Palestinian people, but has not yet been able to consider the future of the American people. Because at the end of the day, he's a Palestinian American, and a keyword American. And I think that is such an important category in the calculus of Trump, where in some ways, whether Trump is intending or not to, he's doing more in the retribution of the American working class than a lot of these activists. And it's something to consider for the future of what must become a very broad peace movement, a democratic demand of the American people for peace. And that's not an abstract concept. The university, they did not just create napalm. It is like we have talked in free school so much about the greatest weapon that the American university at this point has created is the ideological weapons. The ideological weapons have changed the entire material fabric of a city like Philadelphia. Like I was looking at I actually liked this article because I like when people give me nice, neat charts so I don't have to do too much research. But there's this New York Times article that talked about actually beyond Columbia, the university with the highest percent of research funding dependent on the government is Johns Hopkins. It's over 70%, close to 80% of the research funding comes from the government. And I was like, how can that be? What does it go to? And I think Johns Hopkins is not really that well known for, I think, physics and stuff like that. They're most well known for medicine. And Johns Hopkins, if you think University of Pennsylvania is a bad gentrifier, the worst is Johns Hopkins. They have no reason to be in Baltimore. Literally, they're the most unsustainable university in the history of cities. Because they, my friends who have gone there will say, no one ever likes to step off campus at Hopkins. If you think Penn is bad, Hopkins is bad. Why? Because you will get jumped. You will get jumped because in Baltimore, it is a very poor, maybe it's very, 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 very poor. And deindustrialized just like Philly. And Johns Hopkins, that is a university of war, not just war in terms of making weapons or bombs. It is a university that believes that, hey, we have a new vision of society, of a city, where it's a city not driven by democratic jobs for the working class. It is a city driven by meds and ends. That is such a violent vision of a city. That's such a violent vision where the best you think ordinary people should have is part-time service jobs at a hospital, at all these hospitals and university outputs, security jobs, cook jobs, different varieties of service jobs. And the implications are deep and far.
Yeah.
You can see it in Philly. If you do, that's why our sociology of deindustrialization is so important. That is the war economy. That is the university as basically a place of war. And then also the knowledge, the fact that you're producing young people who perpetuate, even if they don't end up working for the state, who are themselves, their visions of themselves and the city and the people around them are so manipulated. And I just wanted to say I was totally also thinking the same thing about Harvard. It's so funny because even the top conservatives in the country all came from Harvard too. Elise Stefanik is literally a Harvard grad. And she came out, she's the one investigating her own alma mater. It's so funny, right? She's a 06 Harvard grad, and she was like, I can speak from experience that Harvard should be persecuted because I didn't learn anything from Harvard. And it's just it's just such a it's like a Shakespearean tragedy or a Shakespearean comedy of civilizational collapse. And I guess the last thing I just want to say is I also really appreciated what Jeremiah said in the doc you built on about the legacy of the civil rights movement. Because in a lot of ways, I think what you said, Doc, about the assassination of King, it is so important to get right. Why was King assassinated?
Yep.
Because I actually think that's very much connected to the universities today. This, what you were saying, basically about the civil rights movement, like, is such an important, the Third American Revolution is such an important, like, basically the way it changed the country, and in the way the universities were not totally, in fact, like, retreated because of with the assassination of King and his standing against the Vietnam War, that there's something there that I think is important. And I think it puts the students at a very important place in the revolutionary process. And I think Trump, and I do think Trump, I think you said this, that Trump is struggling to understand the impact of the Third American Revolution, or him and his administration and the thinkers who were involved with basically an attack on what is the last pillar of American civilization, also not having any way out. And that's where the students and the people and this alternative, and going to like an alternative that was bolstered by the Third American Revolution, becomes so important. So,
I wanted to add like a short piece to what you're saying, because I like how you called it like almost like a Shakespearean tragedy. Because the civilization question, I mean, Trump gets it wrong because he's trying to look for the basis of Western civilization somewhere in the 1800s or something. And the universities are, of course, wrong, or whatever you want to call it, because their basis for what Western civilization even represents comes from that Cold War, post-World War II consensus. And it is tragic that this period, it is tragic that because of this color line, because of this white supremacist social system, you have forgotten, and not just forgotten, I take back forgotten, you have deliberately suppressed this great revolution that actually could give a basis for what Western civilization, what civilization in America could stand for. You know, going from everything like King, beyond Vietnam, this idea that we could be a society that or has a dream for the future, which is not to wage war, which is not to dominate the world, but to develop human beings, new men and women, you know, who can carry the weight of this modern world and so on. It is tragic. Yeah.
Well, what did I say? Lately I've been thinking a lot of the phrase from 1776, which is no taxation without representation. Because even as we're having this conversation on these grants and tax programs for these nonprofit universities, the question is, where is this money coming from? And this money is coming from ordinary people that pay their taxes. And maybe I'm thinking about this because it's just tax day. But at the end of the question, at the end of the day, it's like, would the ordinary person in Philadelphia choose to give their tax money to whatever is being allocated? And the question is probably no. And it always irritates me about this, or the conversation about the healthcare system, as my friends in preschool know, really irritates me, because I think health is supposed to be something that, or the healthcare profession or health is supposed to be something noble, but it's been so corrupted, where and corrupted and manipulated to actually be like, science, you're taking money away from science, and you're taking money away from research and all this bullshit. Because essentially, like, having and then still working in the healthcare system, like, the money that's going to universities isn't going to research. It's, do you need $20 million to actually go to research for this specific disease? Or is of that $20 million, I don't know, 15 million going to research scientists to go to conferences in Las Vegas? Right. And like, is it to go to these conferences in Las Vegas? And I say that as someone who has participated in it. Yes. Like, is this money going to Las Vegas so that you're not, I mean, the whole idea is that, you're building relationships or a network of scientists and exchanging ideas. But I'm pretty sure that that's not what happens. You go out, you have a drink, go to the casinos, whatever it is, and then you go back to your day life. life. And then, so I think that's one piece of it, which is this whole thing of DeepSeek and how they actually use a significantly amount of money to develop this program essentially shows that, which is, do you need these exorbitant, this exorbitant price tag to develop and research something? And the truth is no, which China has proved. And then the other piece is also that I think particularly like, I guess for my friends here, also like, oh, postdocs, research scientists are stressed because their jobs might be taken. That's also like bullshit too, because I've seen literally principal investigators who makes $200,000 or $300,000 or even like $500,000 as they're allocating their budgets. They'd rather increase their salaries by 3%. 3% of $500,000 is much more than increasing the $60,000 or less that undergrad or postgrad researchers are making. They are inflating their salaries, but then they would never consider increasing the salaries of the postdocs or the nurses in these programs. And so, like, I think it just like, I guess the Vietnam War is your hot button. With this, like, the healthcare system is my hot button because I've seen the corruption in these institutions, and the whole thing of justifying it. It's just when people actually look into it, or like, I don't know, I guess what Trump is trying to do or RFK Jr. is trying to do is legitimate because there's so much corruption, and the people who are part of it are implicated. Like, to write a medical guideline, they're paid like, I don't know, $80,000 to write a medical guideline, but it's not to write the medical guideline. It's to go to the Turks and Caicos to write the medical guideline. Meaning is in like, they are paid this exorbitant amount of money, not to do the research, not to do the science, but to travel to some exotic, I don't know, island, chill on the beach and write your paper. And so just, I guess this is one piece, and that just set me off because I think people were talking about the healthcare system. And then what was I gonna say? Shit. Oh, and then I do think this question of the education system is so important, and also of youth in this country, because I think many people, including the children of immigrants, have this idea, and maybe it's less so now than, I don't know, 10 years ago when we were in school, or some of us were in school. Which is this belief in these American elite institutions as places of learning. And even as children of immigrants, that these are the places to go. Because I don't think at any point or going into university, I was not quote unquote political or cared about society like that. And like the mission that my parents raised me on was to go to college and get a job, and probably a well-respected job. And I think the most striking thing is going to undergrad and then realizing I was a good Chinese American student, and I was like, oh, okay, like I'm gonna get my education and not cause trouble. And then I saw these people who are in these rooms like protesting against the school, and I was like, what? You can do that? You can question your education? And yeah, like, I mean, I guess some of it was misguided back then, but still, this concept of questioning your education for what purpose is your education for was something that was so new to me that it like completely broke my brain because I thought, I was at this elite institution that I knew everything or could know the confines of everything. And then here were people questioning, like, what is the purpose of education? And I think that's a big question for a lot of young people today. I think more so now even than when we were in school. And this, shoot, I'm losing my train of thought, but I think it's a really important question, which is what is an education for the people? Because, and then the other thing was that there was this Gallup report on, do Americans think that, what was it? Confidence in higher education, and are these elite institutions going in the right direction? And 64% said no or some confidence in higher education. And then 68% say that higher education is headed in the wrong direction. And so, I mean, I think
a lot of the Gallup report itself spoke to how it's driven by Republican trends, essentially this like DEI, liberal education. But the trend is that at least generally it's gone worse over the years, from like 2015 to 2023. And so it begs the question of like, what is education for? And the last thing that I'll end on is that I think, yeah, it's true that a lot of American elite institutions actually make people dumber because, and I don't just say this because my mom and I oftentimes like the biggest or not disagreement, but is that I think she is definitely of that generation that was, working class and then wanted to send me to school. And then it was like, oh no, like you're smarter than me because you've gone to gone to this college. But then the first time she comes to Philadelphia, she says, why is a city that has so many universities and hospitals still so poor?
Yeah, so interesting.
And yeah, and it kind of just busted the myth that I'm any smarter because I didn't ask that question and she asked that question. And
Democratic capacity.
yes, of ordinary people, which is to ask questions of what is society supposed to be or how society is supposed to be built and for what. But anyways, that just further proves the point that like, what are we protecting with these? Or I'm not saying we, but what exactly are people protecting when they say like, oh, we should keep Harvard or we should keep Columbia the way it is? Because this question of like, what is an education definitely is important.
Yes.
Yeah, I do think that a university education these days is not meant to give you a very holistic education at all. It's meant to sort of drill down on very specific things into you so that you can only ask questions about very specific things. Like the bubble that traps you in these universities makes you feel like questioning anything outside this bubble is off limits, it's out of bounds. And what we were, I think, talking about last week, where we said that these American universities, one of the main purposes that it serves is to set the limits of knowledge. And I feel like it does that. It sets that the limit of knowledge where you can't really break out of it. And being one of those people who actually work with like actual consumables in a laboratory, I can say you do not need that much money to do research. Because when I was in India and I was doing research, we were actually taught to do science and research in a very conservative manner.
Very what?
Conservative.
A conservative manner. Because we had limited resources, so you have to reuse things, you have to wash things, use them again. And yes, that means that you have to spend a little more time doing it, but it conserved resources. It conserved, and it actually also made you think more how to do things more efficiently, how to do things more productively. And here I'm actually criticized for doing things conservatively. They're like, no, spend that money. We have so much money. Why aren't you spending money? Because time is. I have literally been called into an office and said, why are you making this instead of buying this? So, why are you making something instead of just buying something? Because because you can make it for like 25 times less money in comparison to buying it. These companies that also supply universities artificially inflate their pricing because I know how much it costs to make a drug in a laboratory. It does not cost that much when I see it on a website and I want to buy it for an academic purpose. These things have to be. I feel like these things have to be more state controlled. As in, if you are actually saying that all of this money is going towards the betterment of people and society, why does it cost so much? Right? And I actually wanted to add on to what Emily was saying about how the American universities sort of became these ideological centers for control, almost ideological control during the Cold War era. I'm willing to say it actually began right after World War II, because if you look at state funding of American universities, previously American universities used to be privately funded. After Cold War II is when state funding of these universities actually ratcheted up. And you can say, you can make certain assumptions here, but I'm pretty sure that they're true, that this was necessary because the American state after World War II was shifting towards becoming a warfare state. You had the Korean War soon after the end of end of World War II. Then you had the Vietnam War right afterwards. So you needed this investment in American universities to actually get the research going to build more efficient technologies of war. And that went hand in hand with the development of industry during that time as well. You know, last week I was on a taxpayer funded trip to Chicago for a conference. And
Comedy.
and I went to the Harold Washington Library, and they had an exhibit there about the African American steel workers of the Calumet, and they were going through the history of these, because Chicago and the Midwest region was steel industry, and I didn't know about that, and I went through the exhibit, and they were talking about how like after World War II, there was actually a large number of Black people who were displaced from the South to come to the North, to the Midwest, to places like Chicago to work in these steel industries, because they needed all of this industrial production to have all of these materials ready for the Korean War and the Vietnam War and all of the other wars that they were involved with overseas. So I feel like all of this is in a way connected. The motivations are all connected. It goes all back to America's civilizational basis, which is warring with other nations and trying to establish some sort of hegemony. And I feel like what Jeremiah started with today was like a very calm, collected, comprehensive analysis of an extremely complicated situation. Like it's very hard to sort of take all of these threads and try to make sense of whatever is happening. But I did appreciate how he started with saying that this is a battle of narratives in a way, where there are certain narratives that are pushed forward. There are certain narratives that you don't even get to hear about sometimes, and that should, at least it tells me sometimes that, okay, that's where you should at least focus on a little, because there's something there, the narratives that you don't really hear about. And I was thinking about this in terms of biomedical research and Harvard. And I don't know how many people have heard about this, but last year, I think around March or April, the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, which is Harvard's medical center, they had to, I think they did 7 retractions. So a retraction is when you publish a paper and then you have to retract it because it's wrong. And Harvard doesn't do like small scale science. They do like each one of their papers must cost like millions of dollars. And to retract 7 of these papers in a year, and I think that there were like 31 or 32 minor and major corrections that they had to make in journals. That should tell you something. And this is not really publicized very much. It's not in major newspapers or anything. You find it in like small op-eds or other smaller newsletters, or sometimes science Twitter, where they talk about these things. And this is a lot of money that the taxpayers have spent funding research, which eventually led nowhere. And I think close to 50%, maybe more, 50% of all data generated in the biomedical or bioengineering fields are completely irreproducible. So you do it once, nobody in the world can actually reproduce that data again. So what does it mean? Like, where are you generating this knowledge from? Is it real? Is it any use? Can it be trusted? All of this actually, it fuels something in the people, which is why when Jeremiah said like a third of the people don't believe in American universities or don't trust the American universities, it makes sense because there are narratives which are not, thrown in your face in these popular media and newsletters, but they're there. People hear about it, and their distrust develops. And instead of answering that confusion and mistrust, I feel like the universities double down on this approach of you're dumb, we're smart, we're educated, and hence your opinion doesn't really matter. And this is what Jeremiah was talking about, democracy. Like these institutions saying that we are the pillar and centers of democracy. In reality, they are the ones who are limiting democracy as much as possible, but only fronting democracy by using these DEI programs to bring in more people of color and having the appearance of democracy. We have Koreans and Chinese and Black people and Indians and everybody, right? That's a democracy. You have the whole melting pot in academia. But they're excluding the people who actually have legitimate concerns, whose lives are based in material reality. And there's really no sense in why my research back in Urbana-Champaign, why my research was funded by the Department of Defense.
That's what I wanted to ask.
Oh, yeah.
How much of these grants come from the Department of Defense?
A lot of them,
Yes.
actually.
Yeah.
Like I had.
How do you know that?
Because we wrote the grants.
Oh. Half of Hopkins money comes from the Department of Defense.
Medical research.
Yeah, a lot of medical research is funded through the DoD.
Yeah, a lot of medical. Why is the Department of
Yes.
Defense funding breast cancer research? I don't know, but it is, But that is this connection. That is the ideological control that the war industry has over the universities, which in itself has become an industry. Like almost inseparable from the state. And I go into work every day at the University of Pennsylvania, and there's all this talk about, oh my God, Trump is attacking these universities, attacking academic freedom, attacking freedom of speech. What will happen to us? But it's there because these students only have Trump as somebody who they're seeing all the time to vent their frustrations out against. I think they're doing it, and of course, I agree that the teachers and the faculty are egging them on, but the actual administration of Penn, I don't see them taking pay cuts. I don't see them not making $11 million a year. These administrative people, they earn on a higher level than the faculty. The faculty earns $200,000-$300,000 a year. They earn in the millions, and they're not even. And what are they administering? What has the purpose of the university even become? Are you trying to make the next generation of students become well-adjusted members of society or not? And I think that our discussion here has proven that that's really not what they're about. I think I was reading an article in the Daily Pennsylvanian which said that UPenn controls like $12 million worth of real estate in Philadelphia. I mean, why is an educational institution allowed to do that? Unless it's not an educational institution at all.
Yeah.
And it really concerns me. And I think the students see it. I think the students see it and they feel that they are being shortchanged, they're being deceived. And I feel like it is a question for the students, and I had this question for the students, is that how are the students really feeling about these attacks on an institution like the University of Pennsylvania, a university which has in turn attacked them for speaking their mind. And this is why it's a complicated scenario, because the university has repressed the students for freedom of speech, and now Trump is going against the universities and trying to repress freedom of speech. So where do the students stand in all of this? Are they ready to denounce the university as a whole and look to more like what we talked about, like look to the Third American Revolution for an alternative method of educating themselves in today's time?
I had liked that sentiment that you raised about the possibility of sudden collapse, like that point about the crisis and like what that would lead to, revolutionary struggle, or the other civil war. And I bring that up also. I think about that also, but I guess like the other tack on question is like, what is money again? Because if it is a struggle between civilizations, then what is money? But because I was like,
tease that up? That's a very
well,
profound question.
I have another question which may not
I think
even.
there's a book that was written called Civilization and Money, or Money Throughout Civilization.
Oh, really?
But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Well, I mean, I know it's it's a question of value and meaning like, for example, like that Sun Ra thing that you sent. He was like, we're not even gonna really be using money. Like money is about to go out. And I had a conversation last night about like why, if money represents how much debt, like what does money actually represent? And what are you actually buying with? What are we trading with? So it comes to, yeah, I mean, if you want, go ahead. Yeah.
I think you and Alice's mother, who I cherish the fact that we're friends, are the same kind of people who ask the right questions at the right time.
Thank you.
What you have, I mean, this is something so profound. What becomes of all of these values in the face of potential civilizational collapse or civilizational undoing? Because I think here again we talk about the limitations of the political economic understanding of money, or using economic categories to explain money, or seeing money as principally a economic category. What if it is not? It is that, but far more. Suppose money as such represents the values of a civilization, and we value money because we value, I'm saying we, because we value the civilization that protects money and values money.
Because when we're talking
and therefore, Sun Ra in that interview, which I guess,
it's just
where he challenges that nexus of money and civilization. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just because in the context of talking about the war economy also.
Yeah, precisely, which is fueled by money, which is upheld by a certain set of values and hence civilization. And it's very interesting if you don't. So, I'm going to ask you, will you leave me alone, sir? You always start something. But anyway, if the universities are the major centers of the defense of Western civilization, why are they so concerned about money being taken from them?
Come on with it. Yeah.
If it is about civilization,
Then
as Shantu said, why can't we all take a cut and pay? And why not share the wealth of civilization? But in the end, there is a irreparable contradiction, not only between what you say and what you do, but what you value. That is inherently contradictory. You cannot say that a university exists to get rich and to make profit, and then at the same time say it's about high values and civilization. What are you? And like I agree with Alice, if you're about civilization, well, who makes civilization? This is something we were talking about in the preparation for the music conference. Like a lot of people say that jazz is the result of blues.
Right, but
And I said, no, jazz is the result of the consciousness and struggle of Black people. And so let's not say it's the blues.
Right,
Okay, the
because
blues, okay,
genre,
but that too comes out of a people struggling for freedom. And it's the same thing with civilization. Oh, your civilization, but you don't care about the health of your people, the education. If it was civilization, or maybe you have already admitted civilizational defeat, because we do see 10,000 miles away where they keep educating more and more people. You know what I'm saying? And their universities are the top eight of the top 10. So, oh, I'm sorry. But their university, just one more thing. They don't measure their universities by the size of the endowment.
They don't really have endowments like that.
No, they took us nothing is private. It's public. Education is a social, a civilizational value.
yeah.
I can, in fact, y'all don't see it in yourselves, but I can see it so clearly in you all, and Indian and Chinese and Korean, that it's part of your civilizational DNA. Alice's mother, who works in the school cafeteria and has worked there for multiple years, took her daughter to school every day up to and including high school.
Right.
Was up to,
Right.
y'all cut it off in high school? You cut it off, okay. But, I mean, this is a value, a civilizational value, and it is still present, even in the children of immigrants. What does it mean when we claim one thing and degrade the very thing that we claim is at the core of our value? Oh, we're teaching people democracy and yada, yada, yada. Teach me democracy. Teach me to make a living. You know what I'm saying? But that's what so this clash of fundamental purposes, a clash which they cannot resolve. I mean, I'm getting a little emotional about it.
I mean, it's
But it is once it is seen as more. Why is because the questions I have are not so much for Trump, you know, but for the universities.
right.
And even David Brooks and do that kind of acknowledge, well, we have to admit that we ain't always been right in the university. You've been mainly wrong. Yeah, but we ain't always, and we're gonna have to reform the way we do things and yada, yada, yada. Hey, it's too little too late, my friend.
Wow. Yeah.
That's a hell of a question you ask. I hope you pursue that question and do your deep seeks and your Googles. Because there's a long history of this discussion of civilization and money. And the history of money seen from the history of civilizations. And the other thing, and I think maybe when Michelle speaks about the music conference, because we are basically doing a study of civilization.
Yeah.
And this is, but go ahead, I'll shut my mouth.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, yeah.
Because yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, I went to a screening of this film, this documentary that was just released called The Encampments, which was screened. It was screened at Penn, and I think it was produced by Grapefruit News and also by the rapper Macklemore. Yeah, because Macklemore had that big song about Gaza and stuff. But just to keep it brief, I think it kind of confirmed a lot of things that you talked about. And I think, to be honest, increasingly, I really feel for like our colleagues in the preschool who have to like go to UPenn every day or like Princeton, whatever. But I really don't like being on Penn's campus. And I think it reminded me of the feeling, unfortunately, it reminded me of the feeling that we had at the OAH conference, the American Historians Conference in Chicago, because, and this is more so, this is just about the faculty, but there's just an attitude of like self-congratulatory, smug, so smug, and like basically, but it's also pitiful because they feel like relics or like dinosaurs of like an old something that has already died, but they don't realize it yet. And like I guess I bring it up in part because like one of the things that I was feeling at the screening was basically the main people, like it was I think it was sponsored by Faculty for Justice in Penn, as well as American.
The AAP, the Association of like American University Professors.
Right. So like the faculty were very front and center, and they were going to present the screening and stuff. But so it was like mainly faculty there, students who were part of the encampment who were there, and then other basically people from like Philly's leftist scene who were also, tried to kind of ingratiate themselves with the encampment and stuff a year ago. But I think part of it is that on the one hand, I think the film in some ways touched upon all of the unresolved and kind of submerged energy and pent up energy and emotions amongst the students who have not really processed what happened with the encampments. I don't think that any of them have really had the chance to process what happened with the encampments. And like most of them were crying at the end of the film.
They're crying.
Yeah, like there's like a big group of students and they're all basically crying. And at the same time, I think in part it's because the genocide isn't over, the crisis of the university hasn't resolved. But I think what I also felt pretty strongly was I think the faculty, like we said, the faculty just have fundamentally different interests and a different stake in the university. They're much more ideologically invested in the university and are basically, I think, trying to pull the students into a kind of political agenda, which is in the faculty's interest and not in the students' interest, because the faculty are going to be there basically for their careers. The students are only there for 4 years. And I think, I agree with everyone, but I really think that this is a time when even the faculty who are pro free speech, quote unquote, or pro Palestine, I just feel like this is a time when the students have to think a lot more carefully and look a lot more critically, even at the people that you look up to. And this is something that, but this is something that I feel like we went through where it's like, at a certain point, like, you have to make a break, even from the people that you look up to and think that are there to protect you. And most of the times you learn that they're not, and they're really in it for themselves. And you end up being betrayed by these professors who are basically like you see them as your role model. But I think that there is going to have to be like real, I don't know how it's going to manifest or what it will look like, but I think the students are going to have to seriously question not just their relationship to the university as a whole, but even their relationship to the faculty. Because I just feel like it's like this collision course, which is,
I had a lot of thoughts, which is basically, I feel like there's been a lot of energy and effort, I think, to prevent the students from actually processing and like resolving what happened with the campus because it opened up such a fundamental clash. And I feel like over the last the university, the professors, like the Biden administration have been trying to like stitch up that contradiction and try to hold it together. And I feel like in some ways it started because the faculty were the ones who in some ways could mediate between the university and the students to say like, oh, we can protect you, like you can do something within these bounds. And basically because the student organizers, I feel like have been so repressed where they can't really do anything. And so for the last year, you see that it's the faculty who are able to like book rooms or like host events because they are protected, because they're basically the constituents, like they have tenure or whatever. But it's also, yeah, ideologically, the faculty can only go so far when they are interested or capable of going to a certain place. And I feel like in the end, what it results in right now with Trump versus the elite university is this gaslighting, which is that the university like clearly is not protecting you. It has no interest in education, but yet the university now is supposed to shield you from like deportation or like these other things, which are so much worse. And I feel like it gets to some of the strength of the students, which are that I feel like they have not been totally indoctrinated, and in some way their possibility for reality and thus their like democratic capacity, like the possibility for it is much greater than I think these older people who have like been calcified by their experiences to basically only see reality within like the university's vision of civilization. But I feel like on the other hand, the students like didn't have that much experience. And I feel like what you see from the encampments is that a lot of young people basically made a leap. And it's not like they were completely ideologically prepared for like all the ramifications. Like I feel like basically they made a leap against the civilization they were living in. And they're like, wait, like what does this mean? Like what, like what, yeah, like is it like, is what I'm doing basically an argument for free speech? Is it an argument for peace? Or is it like an argument for like American democracy? Like what did I do this for? And I feel like all of these adults, all of these institutions are basically like predators trying to tell you like, no, you did it for this. Like actually you did it to like fight against ICE. Like that's what you did. And but I think in general, I feel like what I got from this conversation is that the university is basically invested in defining civilization on its own terms. And at this point, it's a Western civilization that is completely unmoored from like the base of the civilization, the people who even made it possible in the first place. And I feel like that's like the clash, where it's not even like, I don't know, I don't feel like it's not even really just like the West versus China, but it's even like this society versus itself. And I feel like the one hope of the students is that actually like, if you are able to release this idea that the university and your professors and these adults can protect you, can tell you what you can do, can encourage you, then you might actually be able to find the people and actually like go get to where you need to go and where they intended to go in the first place. But I feel like it's a really difficult and challenging task because of the fact that these universities want you bound to your campus, bound to like these identities that they present you of your clubs and your majors. And they basically gaslight you every single day. Like it's basically like an ideological like barrage every day of like, oh, this is like who you are, like this is what reality is, like read the New York Times. And anything beyond that gets like so like beaten down. And yeah, I just think like it's a really difficult like ideological battle and even like a psychological one because it's of like young people who are not formed, who thus have so much possibility, but are also like sensitive to being formed into a certain shape.
Just one thing what you said reminded me that Villanova was interesting because there were some students in the room listening to Steven Slater talk, and you could tell that they were probably student activists.
They were probably
student activists, like maybe part of the Villanova like stuff. And it was a young man who asked the question before Samir's question. And there's always a certain quality about undergrads. It always sticks where they're just what they have to say is very interesting, their approach, because it's very different. Like, I feel like we're in some ways so boring. We're like, oh, I already know like what my framework is. This is my worldview. But undergrads, they don't have their worldview yet. And this young white man, you could tell Steven Slater's probably a hero to him. He asked such an interesting question. He said, my question is like, the way I read everything going on is that everyone talks about how this is the end of Western civilization. And he used the word end of Western civilization. And, I know that you are in Egypt And since you spent so much time in Egypt these past years, I'm interested in, could you speak on what it's like being not in the West and being in the rest of the world? And does that give us any lessons for how to approach the future? Like, isn't it such an interesting question?
Yes.
And he's looking, like what you said, he's looking to his hero to give some substance. And instead, Stephen Slater couldn't give anything. He was like, he basically was like, I don't have answers for you. Like, I don't know. Like, and it's actually the opposite, because a student like that would respond very well to the music symposium. Because essentially what we're arguing is also the alternative civilization, the alternative worldview you're looking for around the darker world, in fact, already existed within America, in Black humanity, and in the African American struggle.
Yeah.
The nation, even if you want to say the nation within the nation. And it's really deep. Yeah, it's very deep.
Yeah, well, because I think the other thing is that I feel like with Palestine and the encampments, like basically that genocide and like darker humanity is so real, but also so far. And I feel like that was why it was so difficult to sustain once it was taken down. But it's like, no, darker humanity is actually right here,
Right.
like literally here. And once you make that connection, it cannot be taken away. No, like, and I feel like that's like the really, and so I just feel like there's a lot of stuff that's basically like conspiring to prevent that from happening. And yeah, I think also this conversation made me realize like how intertwined like the university and state power is in all of these ways. Like with value, like money. I was like even thinking about this like thing of bubbles where it's basically like you overhype by overvaluing something that isn't actually there. And I feel like in some ways the university is that, which is like you spend $1,000 for an education that doesn't teach you anything. And what would happen if like nobody valued that? And like even this thing of like basically the unity of purpose in the university, which I think was also like with the comparisons and like the sociology of string theory and like postmodernism, and even this thing of like area studies being something started through the Cold War. And when Shantanu was talking about the biomedical studies, I remembered like this was also ironically in one of like my university seminars, but it was like actually like so much of the history of medicine, like modern medicine, is tied to the history of war. And it's tied to eugenics, but it's also like we need to know how to heal people to heal our injured, so that we also know how to injure them, like how to actually kill people more. And I feel like once you sort of heal that back, like you can't go back. Like that is what the university is founded on. There's no discipline that's immune. There's no discipline that's like free from it, because that is the intellectual project.
Can I ask you a question, Nori? And Jeremiah, all y'all, do you feel that Penn is more repressive than Cornell?
Yeah.
Yes.
I feel like Penn is much more organized, concentrated, and intense. I feel like Cornell was kind of loosey-goosey, like half public, like didn't have its act together.
Yeah.
But I feel like Penn, like it's
Hostile.
It's a really hostile.
Why do you ask that?
It's so hostile.
Just, I guess, because I wanted to get a sense of what is different and what might be different between the undergraduates at Penn these days and you all when you were undergraduates. You know, do you see a difference in them because of the repressive nature of Penn?
Well, I think for Penn students, like within the first like semester, 1 year, like so much happens, like ideologically and like personally. And I think not to like over exaggerate or be over dramatic, but I actually think it's a traumatizing experience. Like I feel like it's a constant, like you're constantly gaslighted, you're constantly being attacked. And I feel like the way like people treat each other even on that campus is like something really shocking to me, where I feel like at Cornell it just was not that deep. And I think some of it is because like, yeah, like it's a public school, like you have like agricultural students and like farmers, like people who are literally like, I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna manage my family's like small farm and like work with cows. And I feel like that is like a little bit public. Whereas I feel like at Penn it's like, no, like no matter where you come from like Roanoke, West Virginia, like you're on the same track, just to Wall Street. And yeah.
And can I just say, one of my friends in Wharton, she was actually a farmer. Like she grew up in a farm, but then she went into consulting. Farm to Western Kentucky. She was like, "Oh, the eggs in Philadelphia are so different. Like the yolks were always orange where I grew up on my farm."
I feel like it's like you're constant, and I can't speak as much to them, but even with Cornell though, like you're constantly moving against what you know instinctively to be the moral, like your moral instinct, which is like, yeah, like everyone, the only way you can really cope about it is basically by developing like a cynical sense of humor about everything and be sarcastic. And it's like, oh yeah, we're all going to go into like finance, we're all going to go into consulting. Like, I'm a Christian, but I'm going to join this like consulting fraternity. Like, yeah, there's sort of like business fraternities, consulting fraternities, like fraternities for everything. But it's like, but like people, it's like you're literally like being psychologically like, yeah, you're being psychologically mangled to be like, I'm going to act against what I actually realize deep down is wrong, and then instead I'm going to do it anyway. Everyone's doing it, and it's like that does something to the people, and like it happens to the student activists that we know. It happens to like the regular people that we know, at least from Cornell. But it's like you're constantly like people. I think people have better judgment, but they're being forced and funneled to move against that better judgment and their better morality. Basically.
Which is the essence of the definition of cynicism. Cynicism is not how you feel personally, it's how you see your relationships to other people and how you see other people. So but maybe we can get on to the report on Avant-Garde and the music conference, I guess.
Yeah.
If that's okay. I mean.
Yeah, well, I think you guys should definitely add, but I can start on a few points. Well, for the music symposium, I think what we were talking about today with the civilizational crisis and then situating the music symposium within that is very important. But there were so we meet on Fridays and we have worked out a few things yesterday. So one of them, just to review logistics, the title of the symposium it's 2 days and it's called Seizing Our Future, the Revolutionary Music of Ellington, Mingus, Sonra, and Bootsy. And the two things that we really wanted to highlight, or three things, is like the future, like this is the music of the future. And like it is the music that represents the moral imperative. It is something that can be seized, or the future can be, the moral struggle for the future can be seized through this music. And then we also wanted to say that this music is revolutionary music. Before we call it Black music or jazz or American classical music, let's call it what it is, which is the music of like the revolutionary process, the modern revolutionary process. And so it's going to be in 3 weekends here at the Church of the Crucifixion, Saturday and Sunday. Saturday is going to be the slightly longer day because we're really setting the framing for the entire symposium. And we're looking at Duke Ellington and Charles Mingus that day. So we'll begin at 10 a.m. It's okay. We'll begin at 10 a.m. We'll go for 3 hours and then we'll take a 1 hour lunch break, or we'll take a 1 hour break for lunch. And then we'll return for 3 more hours from 2 to 5 p.m. So Saturday, 10 to 5. And then Sunday, we're dedicating to Sonra and Bootsy, and that'll be in the afternoon from 2 to 7 p.m. And at 7 p.m. afterward, at Doc's request, we're going to have a dance party. So people can go get dinner at that point. But most of the symposium is going to be based around screenings and discussions of these musicians playing their major compositions, them speaking, interviews, the way they saw the world in their own words. And like, this is basically the subtext of the whole symposium, but it is an investigation of the New World Movement thought, which, which like is the key, or is the process of the modern, the project to complete modernity on the terms of the non-European world, the non-Western world. And so these are some of the details we're still fleshing out, but we'll also probably have some poetry readings of Du Bois and Paul Robeson. Like a lot of us have kind of been reading similar essays, like Songs of My People, Criteria of a Negro Art, of the Sorrow Songs. And I think we want to go back to really stitch the ideological fabric of the music together. Well, so I feel like Doc will have a lot more to say, but I guess a few things to pull out from like our planning meeting yesterday. You had said this again, but Doc's assertion that people like to describe jazz as based in the blues. And yes, while that is true, it's let's put it in even more concrete
Right.
or like irrefutable terms, which is to say the conditions that make jazz possible is a high level of human consciousness that comes from a people's commitment to the struggle for freedom, which is the struggle against white supremacy. Like those are the conditions that make this music possible. And so if the music exists today without those conditions, then the music does not actually exist. It's just an imitation of the music, but the music has never been technical. It's
Right.
always been ideological. It's always been political.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and then something else that like we had talked about yesterday that I thought was important was like we're talking about this music at the origin of the New World Movement, right? Blues, sorrow songs, jazz, all of that is happening after Reconstruction, after emancipation, like during the anti-slavery struggles, and it sets the meter or it sets the sound or it begins the development. It is like the musical development of a world revolutionary process, which then explodes in the freedom struggles of India, China, Cuba, like Africa liberating itself from colonialism. It's a lot like Du Bois's novel Dark Princess. And like something that we were talking about is how this music like so advanced the struggle of the proletariat, the darker proletariat, that the proletariat is yet to catch up to it. And so what we're also saying is that in this music, like this music is the language or it's the narrative or the story of the modern, it's also what Jeremiah brought up in his remarks, these modern definitions of the human being, the man and woman who has a rich and a deep democratic capacity to set the definitions for life itself, to set the new definitions for democracy, freedom, education, like science, art, philosophy, industry, everything. And all of that is seen within this music. And then I also wanted to highlight, again, this point that we're looking at 4 specific musicians, not in strict chronology, but because what we're really looking at is also like scientifically and sociologically, what concrete problems they were responding to at each moment. Like, for example, Duke Ellington looks more closely at this question of emancipation has just happened, but Black people are not yet free, or the question of like, how would Black people define emancipation as seen in Harlem, like after the migration up north? And then with Charles Mingus, you have more of that very complex modern collision of a people who have migrated from the southern agrarian life to the northern cities are now a part of modern industry. Like, and then Sonra and Bootsy Collins, I haven't looked at as much, so other people can speak
But
to
I've
that.
heard of the Charles Mingus thing had to also do with King.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes.
Or like the stages of revolutionary
Definitely. Or what is the metaphor of space that Sonra is speaking from at that point, which is like,
Well, what is science for some?
yeah, well, like we would say that it is entirely related to, at that point, all of the liberation struggles that have happened or exploded across the world in like by the second half of the 20th century, where he's able to make certain claims about the leaps that human consciousness will have to make as a whole. Speaking at that's why he has to go to space. So yeah, I think so I think some of what we're working out in the planning still is how the way we frame a lot of these musicians and a lot of these performances, we really want to drive home like the ideological edge or like, you know, the ideological definition, like the philosophical leaps that these musicians are making. Yeah, you guys should add something.
Well, the only kind of thing we've still been working out is Bootsy. And his relationship not only to the 3, but to the symposium, how to frame it. But
yeah,
I guess like just thinking now, I know with Bootsy comes I would suggest maybe that what he's dealing with is a kind of counter-revolutionary period.
Right.
Or because like there's this question of the irony and satire, but I don't know how I know we've been trying to get at it, maybe, I don't know if it'll fit.
Right.
Either way.
Well, we've worked out a number of things, especially where the music comes from. It's not the blues as much as the people. We have to define who they are.
Right.
But anyway, there's one other thing, the profound commitment to knowledge in these composers.
Right.
And
Yeah.
one of the questions we asked, could this music have come from any but the African American?
Yeah.
And it seems that it could not have. Its inevitable origins were inevitable if it were to come into existence. And that's one thing we want to explore that a little bit more, which gets to the question of its contemporary appropriation by people who have no commitment to knowledge or science or any of the things that Sun Ra or Ellington and them talk about. So we wanted to see that. The other thing is the civilizational dimension of this. This new world movement of thought is also a movement, a civilizational situating, the other thing is how they all look, and I'm not certain about Bootsy, but certainly Sun Ra, they all look to the Afro-Asiatic, even Bandung framing of things. And just one small other thing I wanted to say. Oh, we last night we spent some time talking about our outreach, and it's going to be extensive. It's going to be very extensive, and we'll be leafleting at the Germantown Jazz Festival. I mean, if anybody can afford to go up in there, y'all go ahead.
Or stand outside.
But that year we'd be outside because this corporatization and the use of jazz by business people under the guise of we're celebrating jazz and y'all getting paid, and so on and so forth. But that the audience for this, we have to acknowledge, will be a very discreet one. And it will not be mainly musicians. They're not going to come, one, because they think they know it all, and they don't. They have dropped the ball if they ever understood what the ball was.
Dude.
But it will be a special group of intellectuals, and we're not talking about academics, who search for the truth of this music.
Yeah.
So on 50, 60 people overall would be a great turnout. The impact of this will, of course, be through the live streaming, or we're recording it to be live streamed. That'll be part of it. But I just say that to say that the reception and so on of this music is a manifestation of the ideological crisis of the society, including of musicians and artists and of Black people. And I think one of the things that just comes up that, and we asked this question, we talked about, what musicians can we expect to show up unless we pay them? Not Osiris and his collaborator, but the jazz musicians I don't look to. And the reason this is necessary is because the musicians have become some of the worst abusers of the music.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying. It'll be difficult, although we must fight for the youth, for the students who are looking, but that's, this is not a popular area. And, the free school's always dealing with headwinds and bullshit and, people trying to distort what we're doing. But this is at the very core of the revolutionary process. So that,
Well, I just want to underscore what you're saying about what it will mean to, like that outreach will be really important for this event, but at the same time, I think we also know very well, like what our message is, who it is that that must hear this, and the very people who we wish would hear this might not be willing to listen, but we should still make an effort to reach them anyways. But I think something about today's conversation about basically the words that I'm thinking a lot about is just this unfolding, very complex, but very important ideological and civilizational battle, essentially, that I think our music symposium makes a really important, I hate this word, but intervention into. But I think when we were actually talking about the attack on universities today, I was actually thinking a lot about, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but like I'm thinking also about the fact that it's not only the universities that Trump is attacking, but it's all these other wings as well, like the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Endowment for the Humanities, all of these different state like funding agencies that actually do a lot to control and fund and like suppress ultimately culture. But among all of that, what does like jazz represent? And also like in like, the fact that in Philadelphia, April has been declared, I don't know by who or how, like a national month or like a citywide month of jazz. And that's the reason for which there is something such as like the Germantown Jazz Festival, but many other, like other organizations who are using that opportunity to, put on jazz events or in the name of jazz, but also in a way of like getting funding or getting paid to do something. But at the same time, if you think about where the money does come from, I appreciate that, like we did talk about, this comes from like taxpayer dollars. And at the same time is you still have to ask yourself like, but all of this like so-called celebration of jazz is quote unquote democracy, jazz is quote unquote American music, jazz is also even a product of like Black people and their culture. But like at the same time, you look closely and there is really no, as we kind of establish, like progressive vision other than jazz is maybe a piece of entertainment or for nostalgic purposes or even like essentially something that is like commodity. Right. Like ultimately, as much funding as a lot of these organizations have received, you're still having to pay like $50, $60 for one of these
for the tickets, right?
Yeah. So I think what we're trying to do is say, I think something that I thought was really important. Basically that, like we have, when you think about it and what we're trying to say, it's really not about how much, like we had this conversation also about how much it is that what we're doing will take a lot out of us, but at the same time, it's what the people deserve. Like, that it doesn't really take like huge grants or funding from the state to actually have a conversation about like what the people have actually struggled for in this music. And what was it that I was trying to get back to? Oh yeah, I guess this is something not related and I'll try to reconnect my thoughts later, but I thought that one of the great things that we talked about last night was also something that helped me understand the world movement of thought better, which is how much of these musicians are also responding to basically world consciousness.
yes.
Like darker humanity becoming conscious of itself and beginning with emancipation and the anti-slavery struggle, and how much of the whether it's all the various suites that like Ellington composed, the Afro-Eurasian Eclipse, Liberian Suite, Far East Suite, but then also, of course, we were also talking a lot about Sun Ra and what it meant to basically be at this great movement of
And
Yeah.
can I just say one
Okay.
thing? Just go.
No, you should say it first. And then
Okay. One of the things, just like we found with doing Baldwin chronology, it goes back more to Reconstruction than it does to slavery. Slavery, yes, but Reconstruction, and it's Ellington, it's all of that. Mingus, they're all asserting that we were close to freedom in Reconstruction, and then it was taken from us, and now the fight and the discovery of that by them, and how this is connected to the larger anti-colonial struggle in Asia and Africa. That's why this Ellington oeuvre is just so comprehensive.
Wow.
So comprehensive. The Liberian Street, Africa.
New Orleans.
The Asiatic, Euro, whatever, all of this stuff with Iran, with India, and such. It's just, there is nothing comparable to it in the modern history of music. And one of the things I kind of talk about a lot, because, Gustav Mahler is the great romantic, celebrated figure of the late 1800s. Excuse me. You put him side by side with the work of Ellington. It's like, elementary school versus a grown man. The difference is, the claim of European civilization at the end of its term are extraordinary and cannot be validated. And hence, where does modernity turn for the next stage? I think that's kind of what we were. I'm sorry.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
Well, the last thing I wanted to say is I think the music symposium flows really nicely into the science conference.
Yes.
Because what we're also asserting is that all of these composers were seekers and also advancers, seekers of the truth and advancers of knowledge.
There's no two ways
And what's
about it.
unique about this music is that, like, it gives a high place to the role of the imaginary in the creation of revolutionary knowledge. And yeah, I think it's gonna affect like the way we approach the science conference.
half the time I feel like I'm working on a science conference.
Say that again.
Half the time I feel like we're talking about a knowledge.
I feel the same way.
Yeah, the only thing I was gonna add, and I feel like you probably already brought this out, is just that we really proclaim this, even though it's called like the music symposium, I feel like what we really concluded is that it's more than just the music, that it's actually about a purpose or about freedom or about like consciousness. And I think this will be really important to clarify, because it can get lost that, as you're saying, it's ultimately ideological. It's never been technical.
Yeah, well, the only thing I wanted to add is like some points that Doc you had brought up yesterday and Serafina that you had brought up yesterday. Like this emphasis again on that this music could not have been produced by any other people than Black America. And that it's rooted in human consciousness. Like the distinction that you made, like Ellington is able to make certain advancements to the symphonic tradition in a way that Mahler couldn't, because Ellington saw humanity where like the European tradition did not or could not. And I think this does go into something that we had talked about in Bandung, which is like, I feel like like a leap that you had made earlier on Doc, like weeks ago, was that we might conclude that the imaginary is central to seeing reality itself. And I feel like that's also something that maybe is coming out with the science conference, and like the imaginary is central to doing science, which I think is really interesting how those two parallel. And the other point I wanted to kind of like bring up is kind of about like what we're seeing with money or like economics. And I think it's becoming even more clear, like as you're talking about these $40, $50 tickets, that like the Germantown Jazz Festival is charging. And so it's a lot of points, like a really great point yesterday that like, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you can be an artist, but there's no room to actually be an artist now. And so I feel like to defend like the integrity or the essence of this music is also to defend the integrity of the artist.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like that. Yeah.
A defense of the right of an artist to be an artist and not be reduced to an employee of some nonprofit and playing for people who don't understand you and don't care about
Because
you.
art is ideological too.
That's right.
And you could be a proponent of the state, or you could be a proponent for freedom.
Yeah. And you're going to see how this works out in Sun Ra. It's very interesting how he uses all
We're
these
in him now.
metaphors and
Yeah.
what is your orchestra? Is it the Sun Ra
Orchestra.
or orchestra,
Right.
or is it the Myth Science Orchestra,
Right.
or is it the Cosmic Myth Science Orchestra?
Are you?
I mean, it's just and when he talks about they're living in a house in Germantown, which we have to visit, by the way, but living there under conditions of poverty, almost monastically. Isn't this? And whenever, good, I'll shut up. But it's just the more we get, because now we've kind of gotten it like we got it under control. It was we didn't always have it under because you're dealing with all this music, all this, and the ways they talk and so on.
I love it.
Yeah, I love it because they're different. Ellington is more suave, and Mingus is an angry black man. In fact, Mingus was known. There was only one musician who was not afraid of Mingus. Mingus was known for punching his colleagues in the mouth. One had to, but anyway, Julian Priester. Cat out of Chicago, cat that plays bones. We call it bones.
Do you still want to do Avant-Garde? Because it's 2 p.m.
It is 2 p.m.
We'll do Avant-Garde next time.
We have plans. We have plans.
Because music is so interesting. And we will have a dance party. I will DJ.
Oh, but also for the symposium, Doc has suggested some consultants of jazz or whatever. So, the friend that you called yesterday.
Oh yeah, Dave.
The blind, bassist or
bass? Yeah.
Yeah, he said that he had glaucoma. You said glaucoma.
I think it's glaucoma.
And I don't know. I just thought that was kind of inspiring. Even though that there's that whole language that jazz who are into jazz for the right reasons, like jazz heads who know what it's about.
Absolutely.
Like to have that whole language of who played what, how they played, why they played, and what it means. It still is good to expand horizons and know different people who know things like that.
And part of what we're going to do, hopefully, is to draw upon people like Dave Colding, who has a phenomenal memory and understanding of a good part of jazz history. He doesn't know Sun Ra. A lot of people don't know that, quote, free jazz movement. But it's so interesting because, he knows details of the music. Like he's the one that will have you listen to Liberia's Suite, and we had, and there are others. Who else did we say we wanted to talk? Other musicians. We want to talk to a lot of the musicians that we already know, but in a certain sense, we're a little bit disappointed in how almost all of them have dropped the ball. And maybe it's because of making a living.
Yes.
With their music.
It is. You don't care. You don't care.
Cool. I'm excited.
It's exciting.
Yeah. It's very.
It's one of our meetings.
Deeper than deep.
Oh yeah.
It's deeper.
Yeah.
Waters. Yeah. Cool. Definitely.
She fell in love with Charlie Mingus.
I can see that. Yeah.
He's a bad.
I love him. I love him.
Shut your mouth.
Okay.
I don't get the reference.
He's trying to act like Mingus.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think this is interesting.
I like him. I was trying to get him. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you
Okay.
guys for watching.
It's time to say goodbye.
All right.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye. Girl Scouts.
All right, so y'all